Tonight, instead of opening a history book, you are opening a forgotten door that has remained quietly closed for centuries. Beyond it, you find no cheering crowd and no presidential podium beneath bright electric lights. Instead, you enter a 19th century Manhattan home after evening has settled over the city. Lamps glow against patterned wallpaper. Carriage wheels pass somewhere beyond the windows. Books wait on tables, children's footsteps sound overhead, and small natural specimens gather quietly inside cabinets. Here, Theodore Roosevelt is not yet the energetic president remembered in photographs. You meet a thin, frequently breathless boy whose nights can be interrupted by asthma but whose curiosity seems almost impossible to exhaust. You are invited to wander slowly through that lesser-known life, noticing the rooms, animals, books, family habits, private jokes, and ordinary routines that helped shape him. Before tonight's forgotten story quietly unfolds, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you enjoy relaxing journeys through history. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Imagine the old library growing quieter around you. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let history quietly unfold around you. Section 1. You begin in New York City during the 1860s, not far from the busy streets where horses pull carriages over stone and iron-rimmed wheels, send a steady murmur through the neighborhood. Inside the Roosevelt household, the sounds become softer. A fire settles in the grate. Fabric curtains move slightly when cold air reaches the windows. Somewhere downstairs, dishes touch gently together. A child turns another page beneath lamplight. That child is Theodore Roosevelt. I was born on October 27, 1858, into a prosperous New York family, but comfort does not make his early years physically easy. From childhood, Theodore suffers repeated attacks of asthma. You can imagine the difference between the boy later remembered for charging through forests and the child now sitting awake during a difficult night. His breathing becomes tight. Every breath demands attention. His family watches carefully. Asthma treatment in the 19th century is very different from anything familiar today. There are no modern inhalers waiting beside the bed. Families experiment with available remedies, changes of air, warm drinks, medicines. Positioning and whatever experience suggests might bring relief. Theodore's father sometimes takes him out into the night. You picture the city after dark, lamps appearing at intervals along the streets while a carriage moves through cooler air. Young Theodore sits beside the father he deeply admires, hoping the change will ease his breathing. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. is one of the most important figures in the boy's private world. To Theodore, his father seems unusually strong, warm, generous, and capable. He involves himself in charitable work and family life while encouraging his children to use both their minds and their bodies. That combination becomes especially important for Theodore. The boy may struggle physically, yet his attention is extraordinarily active. When you enter his childhood room during daylight, you begin to notice what attracts him. Not expensive toys, not fashionable decorations. Animals, feathers, bones, shells, small creatures. Natural objects that another child might pass without a second glance become invitations to investigate. One of the most famous stories from Roosevelt's childhood begins with something rather unglamorous: a dead seal. While walking in New York, Theodore encounters a seal displayed at a shop. The animal fascinates him so completely that he begins returning to look at it. Eventually, he manages to obtain its skull. From such an unusual beginning comes one of his childhood projects. He creates what he grandly calls the Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. You can almost see the seriousness with which he approaches it. A shelf becomes important. A specimen receives attention. Something collected outdoors is carried carefully home. Labels and observations give order to the growing collection. To an adult visitor, the museum might look like the enthusiastic arrangement of an imaginative child. To Theodore, however, these objects form an entire world. He studies them. He compares them. He wants to know why one bird differs from another, how an animal lives, and what the shape of a bone can reveal. The future conservationist begins here quietly among small specimens in a family house. Outside Manhattan continues changing. Buildings rise. Traffic thickens. Shops fill with imported goods. The city is becoming increasingly urban, yet Theodore's attention repeatedly turns toward wild things. A bird seen through a window can interrupt almost anything. You begin to understand that nature is not merely entertainment for him. It offers a place where weakness seems less important than observation. He may not yet be able to run as easily as other boys, but he can watch, and he watches closely. His eyesight creates another difficulty. Young Theodore is severely nearsighted, though, for some time. Neither he nor the people around him fully understand how poorly he sees distant objects. Imagine standing beside him outdoors. Other children point towards something far away. Theodore sees only uncertain shapes. Then, after receiving spectacles, the landscape changes. Leaves become distinct. Birds gain outlines. Distant details suddenly exist. For a child already fascinated by natural history, the difference must have been remarkable. The exact emotional force of moments like this is difficult to recover. Roosevelt later wrote extensively about his childhood and family members, preserved many memories, but recollection naturally changes with time. Historians can establish the asthma, his poor eyesight, his collecting, and his devotion to natural history. What no document can fully preserve is the precise feeling of being that boy. Perhaps there was frustration, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps curiosity usually arrived before either or. You are left with fragments, and the fragments suggest a child determined to participate in the world even when his body sometimes refuses to cooperate. Books help him travel farther. When breathing or weakness limits physical activity, pages remain available. He reads natural history. He encounters adventures. He studies animals he cannot yet see in the wild. Words carry him beyond Manhattan walls to rivers, mountains, forests, and distant continents. Theodore's family also travels, allowing him to experience landscapes beyond New York. Yet even on journeys, physical illness follows him unpredictably. Asthma does not obey convenient schedules. A peaceful day can become uncomfortable by evening. A bedroom can suddenly feel too small. Sleep can disappear. These nights help give his childhood a rhythm that later portraits often overlook. The famous adult Roosevelt seems almost permanently in motion. The young Roosevelt sometimes has no choice but to remain still. And perhaps that stillness matters. When you cannot rush past something, you have time to notice it. You notice the texture of feathers, the structure of a skull, the habits of insects, the differences between birds. You notice people as well. Theodore grows up surrounded by siblings whose personalities and adventures become inseparable from his own memories. His older sister Anna, usually called Bamie, possesses a steadiness that will remain important throughout his life. His younger siblings, Elliot and Corin, fill the household with their own interests and energies. The rooms are rarely silent for long. There are lessons, conversations, teasing visitors, servants moving through hallways, and family stories repeated around meals. Young Theodore is part of a busy home rather than an isolated sick room. That distinction matters. His illnesses restrict him, but they do not entirely define the household's expectations of him. Eventually his father gives him advice that Theodore will remember for the rest of his life. The message is simple. He has the mind, his father tells him, but he must make his body. The wording survives through Roosevelt's own later account, and historians cannot stand unnoticed in the original room to confirm every syllable. Yet the broader truth is clear. His father encourages deliberate physical development. So somewhere inside the comfortable family home, an unexpected transformation begins. And appears. The thin boy starts training. You hear the quiet movement of weights and the repeated rhythm of effort. There is no audience. There are no photographers. There is only a child attempting something difficult because someone he loves has convinced him that improvement is possible. Progress comes slowly. Asthma does not simply vanish. His eyesight remains dependent on spectacles. His body will continue giving him problems throughout life. Yet a private habit is being formed. When Roosevelt meets a limitation, he often responds by turning effort into routine. Later, this tendency will sometimes become excessive. For now, it is simply a boy exercising in a room. Afterward, he can return to his specimen. Perhaps he adjusts his glasses. Perhaps he opens another book. Perhaps he listens to the faint city sounds beyond the windows while his breathing gradually settles. Nothing about the scene resembles the public figure the world will eventually know, and yet almost everything is already beginning. The love of nature, the hunger for books, the attachment to family, the habit of pushing against physical boundaries, even the unusual ability to transform discomfort into curiosity. As evening returns to the Roosevelt home, you leave the little museum behind and follow the boy toward another part of his private education. The shelves are waiting, and before long Theodore Roosevelt will discover that building his body is only one part of the strange discipline he's creating for himself. Section 2. You remain for a while inside the Roosevelt household, where the small museum of feathers, bones, and specimens waits quietly behind you. Now your attention shifts to another room. Here there are fewer delicate objects. You find exercise equipment instead. Theodore Roosevelt is still young, still thin, and still vulnerable to the asthma attacks that can suddenly tighten his chest. Yet something important has changed since those long nights when breathing itself demanded nearly all his attention. He has begun treating physical strength as something that can be practiced. His father's encouragement stays with him. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. had recognized that his son possessed an energetic mind trapped at times inside a body unable to match it. According to Theodore's later recollections, his father urged him to develop his physical strength rather than surrender to weakness. So the boy begins what he will later remember as building his body. You can picture him approaching the task with the same seriousness he gives his natural history collection. There is repetition. There is routine. There is probably frustration. Muscles do not change because a determined child wishes them to. Breathing does not suddenly become effortless because weights have appeared in the house. Theodore must return again and again. The room itself would have looked very different from a modern gym. There are no humming machines or bright mirrors. Exercise equipment in prosperous 19th century homes might include horizontal bars, weights, pulley devices, and simple apparatus designed for controlled movement. The materials feel solid beneath your hands. Wood, iron, leather. You hear the soft scrape of equipment against the floor. Outside carriage traffic continues through Manhattan. Inside, a boy repeats another movement. What makes this period interesting is that Roosevelt does not become strong overnight. The later legend can make his transformation sound almost magical. A sickly child decides to exercise, then somehow becomes the vigorous outdoorsman familiar from history. The reality is much slower. His asthma continues. He remains nearsighted, and sometimes becomes exhausted. Illness visits him repeatedly, but his attitude toward discomfort begins to change. Instead of seeing physical weakness only as something happening to him, he starts treating parts of it as a problem he can work around. That distinction becomes one of the quiet habits of his life. You notice it first in exercise. Later you will notice it in the reading, travel, work, family routines, and almost everything else he approaches. Roosevelt likes systems. He likes effort that can be repeated. He likes measuring himself against yesterday. As his body gradually strengthens, the world outside the house becomes more available. Walking becomes exercise rather than simply transportation. Climbing becomes a test. Outdoor excursions offer both natural history and physical training. The same boy who carefully observes birds can now challenge himself to reach them across rougher ground. There is a lovely contradiction here. Roosevelt is learning to slow down enough to identify an animal while also developing an almost lifelong dislike of remaining physically still. You follow him through parks and open spaces. The air smells different beyond the crowded streets. Damp soil rises beneath your shoes. Leaves move overhead. A bird calls somewhere beyond immediate sight. Theodore stops. His body may be training, but the naturalist has not disappeared. Her looks, her listens, her remembers. Exercise and natural history begin blending together. This is one reason his physical transformation cannot be separated from his love of the outdoors. I is not merely trying to become muscular. I is trying to gain access to a larger world. As he grows older, that effort becomes more structured and develops an interest in boxing. The sport may seem surprising for someone whose childhood had been shaped by fragile health. Yet Roosevelt is drawn to it precisely because it requires endurance, discipline, and direct physical engagement. You imagine the sound inside a training room. Shoes shift against the floor. Gloves strike padded surfaces. Breathing becomes deliberate. Roosevelt learns that enthusiasm alone is not enough. Technique matters. Balance matters. You cannot simply rush forward forever. This is perhaps an unexpectedly useful lesson for him. At Harvard, where he arrives in 1876, Roosevelt continues boxing and other exercise while building a reputation as an unusually energetic student. His appearance is distinctive. High, slender. He wears spectacles. His teeth and animated expressions make him memorable. His voice has a particular high energetic quality that acquaintances later describe. He does not resemble the simplified image of rugged masculinity that later photographs will create. Instead, you meet a young man actively constructing that identity. He boxes competitively at Harvard and earns respect for persistence, though he is not remembered as the university's greatest boxer. That detail feels important. Roosevelt often enjoys activities without needing to be naturally superior at them, and simply throws himself into the practice. There is an unusual freedom in that. You do not need to imagine him always winning. You only need to imagine him returning. He also walks long distances and spends time outdoors whenever possible. Cold weather rarely seems to discourage him. Rain becomes another condition to experience rather than a reason to remain indoors. Later in life, members of his family and guests will discover that an invitation to accompany Roosevelt on a pleasant walk can become something far more demanding. But that particular private comedy is still ahead of you. For now, his exercise remains connected to youth, health, and self-discipline. Historians can trace many of these habits through Roosevelt's own writings and the recollections of relatives and companions. Yet one uncertainty remains difficult to resolve. How much did exercise truly improve his childhood asthma? Roosevelt himself came to believe strongly in physical effort, and his health clearly became more robust in many ways. But asthma can change naturally with age, and 19th century descriptions of illness do not always fit modern medical categories precisely. You cannot know how much improvement came from training, maturation, environment, or simply the unpredictable course of his condition. History sometimes leaves you with habits more clearly than causes. What you can see is the result in Roosevelt's daily behavior. He begins trusting movement. When tired, he often moves. When troubled, he moves. When restless, he moves. Even recreation becomes active. A quiet afternoon rarely remains quiet for long if Theodore has control of the schedule. And still there is another side to him. After exercise, the same young man can settle into a chair and disappear into a book. The transition is almost startling. One moment you hear feet crossing a room, equipment shifting, or outdoor clothing being prepared. The next you find Roosevelt completely absorbed in printed pages. For him, physical activity and reading are not opposites. They are two forms of appetite. I wants to use the body complete. I wants to use the mind complete. Perhaps that explains something about his unusual private rhythm. He does not seem comfortable doing anything halfway. Even rest often contains purpose. A journey becomes a chance to read. A walk becomes a chance to observe birds. Exercise becomes a moral discipline. A childhood limitation becomes a lifelong experiment in endurance. As another evening settles over the city, you can imagine Theodore returning from exertion with his hair damp and his clothing carrying the faint smell of outdoor air. He removes his spectacles for a moment. The room grows blurry. Then he puts them back on. The shelves sharpen again. And there beside the objects of his childhood museum are the books that have been waiting patiently. His body may have occupied the afternoon. Now his mind wants the night. You follow him toward the lamplight, where another Roosevelt habit is about to reveal itself. Section 3. You follow Theodore Roosevelt toward the warm circle of lamplight waiting beside the shelves. Outside the city continues its evening rhythm. Horse-drawn carriages roll through the streets, doors close against the cooler air. Somewhere nearby, cold smoke drifts above rooftops and settles faintly between rows of houses. Inside, Theodore opens a book. The transformation is immediate. The young man who struggles to remain physically still can sit for long stretches when words hold his attention. Pages seem to disappear beneath his hands with remarkable speed. Reading becomes one of the most constant private habits of his life. You will eventually find books beside him in bedrooms, railway cars, ships, ranch houses, camps, government offices, and quiet corners of Sagamore Hill. For now, however, you are still close to the beginning. His childhood interest in animals naturally leads him toward books about nature. He reads descriptions of birds and mammals. He studies accounts of distant landscapes. He compares what authors describe with what he has observed himself. When an unfamiliar species appears on the page, you can almost sense his impatience to encounter it beyond the book. Yet natural history is only one doorway. Roosevelt reads widely. Adventure stories appear. History follows. Poetry enters the room. Travel writing takes him toward places he has not yet visited. Biographies allow him to spend evenings with people who lived centuries before him. Books become another kind of landscape. You can walk through one without leaving a chair. For a child whose health sometimes limits movement, this offers unusual freedom. Later, when his physical world becomes much larger, the habit remains. Roosevelt develops a reputation for reading with startling speed. Friends and family members often remember seeing him absorb large amounts of material during moments that other people would simply leave empty. A short interval before dinner becomes reading time. A journey becomes reading time. A quiet evening becomes reading time. Waiting itself becomes useful. There is something almost domestic about the habit. You picture a table beside a comfortable chair. A lamp throws yellow light across the paper. The spine rests against one hand. Perhaps another book already lies nearby. Roosevelt does not always treat books as precious objects requiring perfect silence. He reads them as tools, companions, entertainment, and sources of argument. A page may be folded. A passage may be remembered. An idea may reappear later in conversation. He reads quickly enough that later observers sometimes wonder whether he can truly absorb everything. Yet his memory often surprises them. He can discuss what he has read. He recalls characters. He remembers arguments. He connects one book with another. The private reader is not simply collecting pages. He is collecting material for thought. You notice another habit forming. Roosevelt frequently reads more than one kind of book at a time. After serious history, he might turn toward fiction. After politics or science, poetry may offer a different rhythm. This variety seems to keep his attention fresh. It also gives his evenings a curious texture. The same person can spend an hour thinking about ancient civilizations and then disappear into a novel before bed. Books become a way of changing rooms without moving. His family learns to live around this appetite. At times, conversation competes with the page. At other times, reading becomes part of family life itself. Books are discussed. Stories are shared. Children later hear passages aloud. The private habit becomes communal without losing its personal intensity. Roosevelt also writes as naturally as he reads. Letters begin accumulating. Notes appear. Observations from the outdoors become records. Ideas gathered from books are tested against experience. This matters because reading for him is rarely passive. I wants to answer. I wants to describe. I wants to compare what another writer claims with what he has seen. The naturalist in him remains present even when the subject changes. You can imagine him pausing over a sentence. He adjusts his spectacles. The fire shifts softly nearby. Perhaps he disagrees. Perhaps he smiles. Perhaps a detail sends him toward another volume. A single page can open several paths at once. The unusual part is how little ceremony he seems to require. Some readers create perfect conditions. Roosevelt learns to read almost anywhere. That ability becomes especially useful later when his life grows crowded with travel visitors, children, public responsibilities, and outdoor expeditions. Books fit into the spaces between everything else. At Sagamore Hill years from now, you will see shelves crowded with volumes. You will find reading woven into family evenings and quiet hours. You will notice that the man famous for physical action still spends enormous amounts of his private life surrounded by paper. That contrast is easy to miss. Public memory prefers movement. A horse crossing open country is more dramatic than a chair beside a lamp. A hunter in rough clothing is easier to turn into legend than a father quietly reading after dinner. But the books may tell you just as much. Roosevelt's extraordinary energy requires somewhere to go when his body is still. Reading gives it direction. His speed also creates small mysteries. Later descriptions of how many books he could finish vary, and memories sometimes grow more impressive as years pass. Exact numbers are difficult to prove. What historians can establish is simpler. He read constantly, broadly, and quickly throughout much of his life. The exaggerations are almost unnecessary. The documented habit is remarkable enough. You return to the room. Theodore has reached another chapter. The hour is later now. The household grows quieter. Footsteps become less frequent in the hall. The smell of extinguished lamps begins to mix with wood smoke. Outside, the street noise thins. Still, the pages continue turning. His eyesight requires glasses, but once the print becomes clear, his attention moves rapidly. There is a gentle irony in this. The boy who once struggled to see distant objects becomes a man famous for looking intensely at the world. Books help train that gaze. They teach him to search for patterns. They introduce landscapes before he visits them. They fill his imagination with creatures, people, and places. They also give him language for experiences he has not yet had. Soon those experiences will begin arriving quickly. Travel, college, love, loss, the West, family life, public responsibility. Yet through all of them, a book will usually remain nearby. You may even think of reading as one of Roosevelt's most dependable forms of rest. Not complete rest, and rarely seems interested in complete stillness. Instead, reading allows one kind of energy to quiet while another remains awake. The body settles, the mind travels, and tonight, while the lamp burns lower, you can see the pattern beginning before the world has any reason to notice it. A young Theodore Roosevelt turns another page, then another. Beyond the windows, New York disappears into darkness. Inside, whole continents are opening. When morning comes, the books will still be there, but so will the family around him. And within that lively household, you are about to discover where many of Roosevelt's private habits first learned to feel like home. Section 4. You leave the lamplit books for a while, but you do not leave the Roosevelt household. Theodore's reading life makes more sense once you notice the people moving around him. This is not a silent home built around one unusually curious child. It is a busy family world filled with voices, lessons, visitors, private jokes, travel preparations, pets, and the constant movement of 4 children growing up together. Theodore is known within the family as Teddy. The name belongs to the intimate world before newspapers begin printing Roosevelt in enormous letters. Nearby is his older sister Anna, usually called Bamie, whose calm intelligence and practical nature will make her one of the people Theodore trusts throughout his life. Then there is Elliot, Theodore's younger brother. Corinne, the youngest, completes the group. You hear them before you see them. A door closes upstairs. Someone calls from another room. Shoes hurry along a corridor. Then comes laughter, followed perhaps by the familiar silence, suggesting that a child has suddenly remembered an adult is nearby. The Roosevelt children are raised in considerable comfort, but their parents expect much more than polished manners. Their father encourages activity, generosity, curiosity, and responsibility. Their mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt, known as Mitty, brings another texture into the household. She was born in Georgia. Her memories and family connections belong partly to the American South, giving the children a family history more complicated than the tidy categories later biographies sometimes prefer. The Civil War passes through Theodore's earliest childhood. His father supports the Union cause, while members of his mother's Southern family have Confederate connections. You are standing inside a household where national division is not merely something reported in newspapers. It reaches quietly into family relationships. Exactly how young Theodore understood these tensions remains difficult to reconstruct. Children absorb atmosphere long before they understand politics. Perhaps he heard names mentioned cautiously at meals. Perhaps certain conversations changed when the children entered. The surviving memories tell you much about loyalties but less about the tone of ordinary evenings. That uncertainty is part of private history. What remains clearer is that family identity matters deeply to Theodore. He grows up surrounded by stories. Some concern relatives, others concern journeys, still others involve animals, adventures and places beyond New York. When the family travels, Theodore observes everything. In 1869, the Roosevelts undertake a long European journey. For a child fascinated by the natural world, travel offers an almost overwhelming supply of new material. You imagine train stations echoing beneath high roofs, leather trunks gather beside platforms, steam drifts along railway lines. Hotel corridors smell of polished dust and unfamiliar cooking. Outside, every landscape seems new. Theodore watches. Churches, streets, mountains, animals, languages, and faces all become part of the private archive he's building in his mind. A few years later, another family journey carries the Roosevelts toward Egypt and the Holy Land. Now the scenery changes dramatically. You move with Theodore beneath brighter skies. The air feels drier. The colors of stone and earth seem sharper. Along the Nile, birds become especially important. Theodore studies them intensely, recording observations and collecting specimens. The child who created a tiny museum back in New York now encounters a living natural world far beyond anything a shelf could contain. Family travel therefore becomes more than education. It becomes fieldwork. Even meals and resting places can turn into opportunities for observation. If a bird passes overhead, Theodore notices. If an animal appears beside the road, his attention follows it. His relatives gradually become accustomed to this habit. You can imagine the mixture of affection and patience required when traveling with someone who considers every feather worthy of investigation. There is subtle comedy in it. A family may believe it is going somewhere. Theodore may believe the real purpose is seeing what lives along the way. Back at home, curiosity continues in smaller forms. The Roosevelt children keep animals. They collect things. They build games around the rooms available to them. Books mix with household objects and imagination turns ordinary furniture into something more interesting. Their education also takes place largely within the family environment during Theodore's earlier years. Because his health can be unreliable, he does not experience childhood schooling in exactly the same way as many boys of his social background. Tutors and lessons come into the home. This means education unfolds close to family life. 1 hour may involve mathematics or language. The next may be interrupted by illness, a visitor, an animal, or some irresistible observation outside the window. I begin to understand why Theodore developed such broad interests. His world is not divided neatly into separate compartments. Learning, family, travel, nature, exercise, and play continually overlap. His siblings shape him as much as the rooms do. Bammy, in particular, becomes a stabilizing presence. She has physical challenges of her own, including spinal problems, yet develops a reputation within the family for intelligence and strength of character. Theodore will rely on her judgment long after childhood ends. Elliot is charming and athletic, a companion close enough in age to share many experiences with Theodore. Their paths will eventually separate in painful ways, but during these earlier years you encounter two brothers growing together within the same lively household. Corinne watches the family from the youngest position. She will later become one of the important keepers of Roosevelt family memory. This creates another historical difficulty. Much of what you know about childhood survives because family members wrote about it later. They remembered beloved parents, amusing habits, illnesses, journeys, and conversations. But memory is not a perfectly clear window. Families polish stories through repetition. A funny incident becomes for funnier. A childhood trait begins to look like an obvious sign of the adult to come. Historians must therefore separate what happened from the meaning later generations gave it. Perhaps young Theodore's museum seemed amusing rather than prophetic at the time. Perhaps his energetic habits did not always appear admirable. A child who never stops asking questions can be delightful in a memoir. Living beside him every day may have required more patience. You walk through the rooms with that possibility in mind. Nothing here knows the future yet. The shelves do not know they belong to a president. The children do not know which family stories will survive. The pets do not know they will become charming details in biographies. This is simply home. Dinner is prepared. Clothing is brushed and repaired. Lessons are completed. Arguments appear and disappear. Someone becomes ill. Someone recovers. Visitors arrive. Theodore reads. Then he disappears to examine something. At the center of it all is a strong feeling of family belonging. Roosevelt will carry that feeling into adulthood. He will build his own noisy household. He will give his children names. He will fill rooms with books and animals. He will encourage vigorous outdoor life. Again and again you will see patterns from these early rooms returning in later houses. That may be one of the quietest secrets of his private life. Before Theodore Roosevelt constructs his famous public identity, he first learns what a home should feel like. Busy, curious, affectionate, slightly disorderly, never entirely silent. As evening settles, you pause near the doorway. The children are somewhere deeper inside the house. A book lies open. A specimen waits on a shelf. Travel souvenirs hold memories of landscapes far away. And among these familiar objects, one relationship is beginning to take on a different importance. A girl named Edith Caro has been part of Theodore's world since childhood. Soon the rhythms of family friendship will become something quieter, more complicated and far more personal. Section 5. You leave the noisy Roosevelt children behind and follow one familiar figure into a quieter corner of Theodore's early life. Her name is Edith Kermit Caro. Before she becomes the woman managing a presidential household, she is simply a girl who belongs to Theodore's childhood world. The Caro family lives close enough to the Roosevelts for the children to know one another well. Edith visits the Roosevelt home, joins family activities, and grows familiar with the same rooms where Theodore keeps books and natural specimens. You can imagine her entering beneath the high ceilings and patterned walls. There are voices upstairs. A servant crosses the hallway. Perhaps Theodore appears carrying some object he considers extremely important. Edith is intelligent, observant, and fond of books herself. That shared interest matters. Long before Washington, official dinners, and carefully arranged public appearances, the two young people can talk about reading. Theodore sometimes reads aloud with her. They exchange thoughts about stories and writers. The relationship belongs first to the gentle familiarity of childhood. No one standing in those rooms can know what it will eventually become. Even Theodore does not move directly toward Edith. As he grows older, another young woman enters his life. Her name is Alice Hathaway Lee. You meet her in the social world of young, prosperous families around Boston and Cambridge. Theodore is immediately captivated. Alice is remembered as graceful, cheerful, and strikingly beautiful. He courts her persistently. For once, the young man who usually fills his attention with books, exercise, birds, and ambitious plans seems willing to rearrange everything around another person. They marry in October 1880. Theodore is 22. You can picture the first rooms they share filled with the small expectations of a marriage that appears to have decades ahead of it. Letters move between them when they are apart. Plans are made. Family visits are arranged. A domestic future begins forming. Then, in February 1884, that future breaks apart with astonishing speed. Theodore is away in Albany when he receives news that Alice has given birth to their daughter. He returns to New York and finds two women he loves gravely ill beneath the same roof. His mother, Mittie, dies from typhoid fever. Alice dies only hours later, suffering from kidney disease complicated by childbirth. You do not need to linger over the medical details. Private history is often most powerful in what remains quiet. A young husband walks through familiar rooms that suddenly feel entirely changed. His mother is gone. His wife is gone. His infant daughter, also named Alice, survives. Roosevelt records the day in his diary with a dark mark and a brief sentence expressing that the light has gone out of his life. Afterward, he speaks very little publicly about his first wife. That silence has created one of the more difficult spaces in Roosevelt's private story. Historians know that he loved Alice deeply. They also know that he later avoided writing extensively about the loss. Why he chose such restraint cannot be known completely. Perhaps silence was how he endured grief. Perhaps he feared reopening it. Perhaps the emotions were simply too private for the energetic, autobiographical voice he later created. You follow him away from New York. The western landscape begins calling. For a time, the Dakota Badlands offer distance, physical labor, weather horses, and the hard routine of ranch life. Yet the story does not end there. Eventually, Theodore returns east, and Edith Caro returns to his life. The childhood companion is now a young woman. They meet again in New York, and something familiar has changed. Their renewed courtship remains comparatively private. That privacy is partly deliberate. Theodore is a widower, and Victorian expectations surrounding mourning can make remarriage socially delicate, especially when the first marriage is still remembered by family and friends. You can imagine the careful conversations. A visit lasts longer than expected. Books return as a shared language. Memories of childhood create a kind of shorthand between them. Edith already knows the family atmosphere from which Theodore came. She knows his intensity. She knows his love of reading. She probably understands that a quiet afternoon with Theodore may not remain quiet for very long. They become engaged privately. In December 1886, Theodore Roosevelt and Edith Caro marry in London. The ceremony takes place at St. George's, Hanover Square. The setting is far from the future American White House. Winter light falls across London streets. Carriages move through the cold. Heavy coats carry the damp smell of the season indoors. The marriage begins without the vast tension that will later surround almost everything the Roosevelts do. After their wedding, Theodore and Edith begin building the household that will become the real centre of his private life. Their home at Oyster Bay, later known as Sagamore Hill, provides the setting. There is already one child within the family. Little Alice, Theodore's daughter by his first wife, initially spends much of her early childhood with Theodore's sister Bamie. Eventually she becomes part of Theodore and Edith's household. That arrangement is not always emotionally simple. Edith must become stepmother to a child whose mother remains an unspoken presence. Alice grows into an independent and sometimes difficult young woman. The private relationships between Edith, Theodore and Alice will carry affection, tension, loyalty and occasional frustration for years. Yet there are also new children. Theodore Jr. arrives in 1887. Kermit follows in 1910. Ethel is born in 18. Archibald arrives in 1809. Quentin, the youngest, comes in 1819. The household expands. So does the noise. Edith becomes the organizing force behind it. This is one of the most important private facts about Theodore Roosevelt's adult life. His public energy is supported by a domestic world that someone else keeps functioning. Edith manages servants' meals, children, visitors, household finances, travel arrangements, and the complicated social expectations surrounding her husband's career. She is not merely standing beside him in photographs. She creates order around a man who generates extraordinary amounts of activity. You can almost see the contrast. Theodore enters a room quickly carrying letters or books. He begins talking before he is fully settled. A child interrupts. A dog appears. Someone is expected for dinner. Another visitor may already be arriving. Notices what must actually happen next. Her temperament is more controlled. She values privacy. She reads widely. She understands social details Theodore might overlook. When he becomes absorbed in an idea, she helps protect the household from being completely swallowed by it. Their marriage also contains humour. Edith is capable of gently cutting through Theodore's enthusiasm. She does not always treat his opinions as final merely because he expresses them loudly. That may be one reason their partnership lasts. Theodore spends much of his life surrounded by people impressed by him. At home, he encounters someone who knew him before the legend existed. Still, not every private feeling survives clearly. Their letters reveal affection, practical concerns, separations, children, health and travel. But even correspondence cannot reconstruct every conversation between husband and wife. You do not know precisely how often Edith worried when Theodore disappeared into dangerous landscapes. You cannot measure how much irritation accompanied another overflowing schedule. You can only observe the household they sustained together for more than 3 decades. And as you move toward Oyster Bay, the air begins to change. The crowded streets of New York recede. Salt air reaches you from Long Island Sound. Trees gather around a large house on a hill. Children will soon race through its rooms. Animals will appear in unlikely places. Books will cover shelves. Guests will arrive expecting rest and discover Theodore Roosevelt has other plans. But before Sagamore Hill becomes that famous family home, you must follow Theodore through another landscape. The wind is sharper there. Grass bends beneath the enormous skies. And after the losses of 1884, the Western country becomes one of the strangest private refuges of his life. Section 6. You leave Oyster Bay before the house on the hill can fully come alive and you travel backward for a moment into a harsher landscape. The year is 1884. Theodore Roosevelt is 25 years old. Only weeks earlier he has lost both his mother and his young wife within hours of each other. The rooms of New York have become crowded with memory, and the ordinary objects of family life now carry a weight that no amount of conversation can soften. So you follow him west. The journey toward the Dakota Territory changes the air around you. Into open country, railway stations become smaller. The horizon grows wider. The smell of coal smoke from the train eventually gives way to dry grass, dust, leather horses, and the sharp, clean scent of wind moving over empty land. This is not Roosevelt's first visit to the West. He had already traveled to the Dakota Badlands in 1883, hoping to hunt buffalo and experience ranch life for himself. What he found fascinated him. The landscape was rough, deeply eroded, and unlike anything in the cultivated East. Grey and brown formations rose in strange shapes. Cottonwoods followed the river bottoms. Grassland stretched outward beneath enormous skies. Weather could change quickly. Sunlight could become wind. Wind could become cold rain. And everything seemed farther apart. Roosevelt invested in cattle and began developing a ranching life that was at first partly an adventure and partly a business experiment. After the deaths of 1884, however, the West takes on a different meaning. Now it offers distance. You can feel why that matters. In New York, almost every room contains someone who knows what happened. Every familiar face may carry sympathy. Every conversation can circle back toward loss. In the Badlands, there is work instead. There are horses to saddle, cattle to find, fences to inspect, meals to prepare, distances to ride, storms to endure. Roosevelt does not speak much about grief while he is there. He moves. This becomes one of his lifelong private patterns. When emotion becomes overwhelming, he often turns toward the physical effort. You follow him into the saddle. The leather creaks beneath him. The horse breathes into the cold morning air. The ground is uneven and the trail does not politely announce itself. Roosevelt rides for hours. Sometimes he rides through rain. Sometimes dust clings to his clothing. At night he may return exhausted enough that sleep comes more easily. The ranching world gives him a routine built around necessity rather than reflection. His main base becomes the Elkhorn Ranch, established along the Little Missouri River. The house is built from cottonwood logs. It is not a palace in the wilderness. The rooms are practical. There are books. There are simple furnishings. There are animal skins, equipment, and the rough materials of ranch life. Outside, the river moves past quietly. You can imagine the sounds before dawn: a horse stamping, wind brushing dry grass, someone shifting near a stove, wood catching fire, coffee beginning to warm. Roosevelt likes strong coffee. Breakfast might include meat, bread, beans, or whatever is available and practical. Luxury is not the point. The point is a life structured by the landscape. One unusual detail survives from this period. Roosevelt brought books west in considerable numbers and read whenever weather or darkness interrupted outdoor work. The image is almost perfect for him. After a long day on horseback with dust on his clothes and cold air settling outside, he can still sit down beneath lamplight and disappear into literature. The rancher and the reader are never separate people. Who reads history? Who reads poetry? Who reads novels? He writes as well. The West becomes material for future books and articles. But in these quieter months, writing also seems to help him organize experience. You watch him fill pages. Descriptions of animals appear. Weather enters the record. Ranching practices become observations. So do the people he meets. Cowboys, hunters, ranchers, laborers, settlers, and local characters all become part of Roosevelt's Western education. He admires competence. A person who can handle a horse, endure bad weather, or complete difficult work earns his respect quickly. The opposite is also true. Roosevelt has little patience for laziness when he believes effort is possible. At times this makes him demanding. At other times it makes him almost comically eager to prove that he can endure whatever everyone else can endure. You can imagine older ranch hands watching the bespectacled Easterner, trying very hard not to appear delicate. He does not always look naturally suited to the part. His clothes can seem too new at first. His accent marks him immediately. His glasses are impossible to hide. Yet persistence slowly changes how people see him. He rides hard. He accepts discomfort. He learns. The West does not erase his earlier identity. It adds another layer to it. Still, the popular story that Roosevelt simply cured his grief by becoming a cowboy is too neat. Grief does not vanish because the scenery changes. There must have been quiet hours when memory returned. Perhaps late at night. Perhaps beside the river. Perhaps when a letter arrived from the East. The surviving sources do not allow you to know exactly what he thought during every lonely evening. That uncertainty matters. His later autobiographical writing often presents the Western years as a period of vigorous action and personal testing. It tells you a great deal about what Roosevelt wanted to remember. It tells you less about what he chose not to record. His infant daughter Alice remains back east for much of this period under the care of his sister Mamie. That separation is another part of the private story. Roosevelt loves his daughter, yet he is not ready to build a household around her immediately after her mother's death. You cannot fully reconstruct his reasoning. Practical concerns matter. Grief matters. Family support matters. But the emotional details remain partly hidden. While Alice grows in familiar eastern rooms, her father rides beneath western skies. The seasons change. Spring softens the ground. Summer brings heat and insects. Autumn sharpens the evenings. Winter turns the Badlands severe. Snow can hide trails. Cold penetrates clothing. Cattle suffer. Roosevelt learns that the romantic West of books is also a place where animals die, businesses fail, equipment breaks, and weather ignores human plans. The devastating winter of 1886 to 1887 will eventually destroy much of the cattle industry in the region and cost Roosevelt heavily. But before that final blow, the ranching years give him something quieter than profit. They give him a private landscape to return to in memory. Years later, he will describe the Badlands with affection, not because they were ease, because they demanded his full attention. You understand why that mattered in 1804. A mind filled with loss is given immediate tasks. A body already trained to answer difficulty with effort is placed inside a world requiring constant movement. The horse needs direction. The weather must be watched. The river must be crossed. The cattle must be found. And for a few hours, grief has to share space with practical life. As evening settles over the little Missouri, you see Roosevelt returning toward the ranch house. Dust darkens his boots. His face is tired. A lamp is lit inside. Books wait beside a table. The river moves slowly beyond the cottonwoods. There is no crowd here. No office. No presidential future. Only a young widower in an isolated landscape learning how to continue one ordinary day at a time. And when morning comes, you will stay with him. Because at Elkhorn Ranch, even the most ordinary hours reveal how deeply the West entered Theodore Roosevelt's private life. Section 7. Morning reaches the Elkhorn Ranch slowly. Before the sun rises fully above the broken ridges of the Dakota Badlands, you hear the ranch waking around you. A horse moves in the darkness. Leather tack creaks. Boots press against hard ground. Someone opens a wooden door and cold air slips immediately into the room. Theodore Roosevelt is already awake. Life here does not begin with ceremony. There are no bells announcing breakfast, no polished city carriage waiting at the curb, and no carefully dressed visitors asking for his attention. There is work. The fire must be encouraged. Coffee must be prepared. Animals must be checked. The weather must be judged before anyone decides how far the day can safely carry them. You step outside with Roosevelt. The little Missouri River lies below the ranch, moving quietly through the valley. Cottonwood trees stand along its banks. Beyond them, the Badlands rise in dry layers of clay rock, grass, and shadow. In early light, the landscape looks almost gentle. Later, under a hard afternoon sun, it will feel entirely different. Roosevelt loves these changing moods. He watches the sky carefully. A clear morning might mean hours in the saddle. A distant bank of cloud might change the entire plan. Weather here is not background. It is part of the schedule. At Elkhorn, Roosevelt shares the ranch with people who know the region better than he does. Foreman cowboys, ranch hands, and neighbors move through his western life. Two particularly important figures are Sylvain Ferris and Bill Merrifield, experienced frontiersmen who help manage Roosevelt's ranching interests. Roosevelt depends on men like these for practical knowledge. You notice something revealing in the way he learns. He asks questions. Then he tries things himself. He does not want only to be told how to rope ride track animals or manage cattle. He wants experience in his own hands. That desire sometimes makes his days longer than necessary. It also makes mistakes inevitable. A horse may resist. A trail may disappear. Equipment may fail. Roosevelt does not always look elegant while learning. That may be part of the charm of these private years. Later photographs will make the Western Roosevelt seem completely at home in buckskin and boots. Here you see the process before the image becomes polished. Breakfast is simple. Coffee is strong. Food is chosen for energy rather than refinement. The smell of wood smoke mixes with meat bread and the cool scent of the river. Conversation is practical. Someone discusses cattle. Someone comments on the weather. A story from the previous day may grow slightly more entertaining in the retelling. Roosevelt listens closely. He likes stories almost as much as he likes books. The men around him carry local knowledge that cannot be found on a library shelf. They know where water remains during dry weather. They recognize signs left by livestock. They understand which horse can be trusted on uncertain ground. They know how quickly a calm sky can change. For Roosevelt, this becomes another kind of education. After breakfast, you ride out. The rhythm is steady. Hooves strike earth. Saddle leather shifts beneath your weight. Dry grass brushes against the horse's legs. For long stretches, conversation becomes unnecessary. The open country is too large for constant talking. Roosevelt seems comfortable with that silence. He can be famously talkative among the friends, but the outdoors allows another side of him to emerge. He observes. A bird crosses the sky. His attention follows it. Tracks appear in soft ground. He notices them. A distant animal becomes a point of discussion. The naturalist of childhood is still traveling beside the rancher. Roosevelt keeps detailed interest in the wildlife of the Badlands. He studies birds, mammals, habitats, and seasonal changes. He hunts as well, which was closely connected with natural history in his era. To modernize, the combination can seem contradictory. Yet Roosevelt came to believe that careful hunting and conservation could exist together, especially when contrasted with uncontrolled destruction. Those larger conservation ideas are still developing. At Elkhorn, they begin with daily observation. You spend enough time outside to notice when animals become scarce. You notice how cattle alter grasslands. You see how water determines the movement. The landscape teaches slowly. Round midday the sun becomes stronger. Dust gathers on clothing. Your lips feel dry. The horse breathes heavily after a long climb. Roosevelt does not seem to mind discomfort if he believes it has a purpose. He often pushes himself hard. This habit can be admirable. It can also be unreasonable. People who spend time with him learn that his definition of an ordinary day may be considerably more demanding than theirs. There is a gentle humour in imagining a ranch hand discovering that the enthusiastic Easterner has decided a distant ridge should be reached simply because it is there. Still, Roosevelt is not performing for an audience. Most of these hours leave no famous photograph. They consist of routine: checking cattle, repairing something, crossing water, returning along a trail, eating when hungry, reading when darkness makes outside work impossible. That ordinariness is precisely what makes the Elkhorn years important. The West becomes part of Roosevelt not through a single adventure but through repetition. Day after day he wakes beneath the same broad sky. He learns the same river. He reads through familiar valleys. He begins recognizing individual features of the land. A particular ridge, a bend in the water, a cluster of cottonwoods, a path used by animals. Place becomes memory through repetition. The ranch house itself provides another rhythm. When bad weather arrives, life contracts indoors. Rain strikes the roof, wind presses against the logs, mud thickens outside. Then Roosevelt turns once again to books. You see him near the fire reading while wet clothing dries nearby. This detail surprises visitors who expect the cowboy version of Theodore Roosevelt to reject indoor comforts. He never does. He carries civilization with him in printed pages. Books may share space with rifle saddles, animal skins, and muddy boots. The combination seems perfectly natural to him. He also writes letters east. These letters reconnect him with family life temporarily left behind. News travels slowly compared with conversation. A letter must be written, carried, transported, delivered, read, and answered. Days or weeks may separate question from response. That waiting creates a different emotional pace. Roosevelt can ride hard all day, but he cannot make a letter arrive faster. Somewhere far away his daughter Alice is growing. His sisters continue their lives. Friends marry, travel, and work. New York continues without him. The Badlands begin to feel both like refuge and temporary exile. How much Roosevelt consciously intended to remain here is uncertain. His later memories sometimes give the Western period a neat shape as though he knew exactly what it was meant to accomplish. Real life is usually less organized. He may have imagined several futures. Perhaps ranching would remain central. Perhaps public life would pull him east again. Perhaps he simply did not yet know. You stand outside the ranch near sunset. The temperature falls quickly. Light stretches across the strange formations beyond the river. Shadows deepen into blue-grey folds. A horse drinks nearby. Smoke rises from the chimney. Inside, someone is preparing supper. Roosevelt looks tired, but not empty. The day has demanded enough of him. That may have been part of what he needed. Not escape from memory. Something strong enough to stand beside it. Later, the ranching business will suffer badly. Weather will destroy cattle. Money will be lost. The romantic image of endless Western possibility will meet the harder facts of climate and economics. Yet Elkhorn will remain one of the places Roosevelt remembers with unusual tenderness. You can understand why. Here his private life is reduced to basic elements: work, weather, food, books, horses, companionship, sleep, morning again, and when you finally turn eastward with him, you carry those rhythms back toward another house waiting on Long Island. There, the quiet ranch routine will give way to children, visitors, dogs, books, meals, laughter, and a household so lively that even Theodore Roosevelt will occasionally struggle to keep up. Section 8. You leave the wide Dakota sky behind and return east with Theodore Roosevelt carrying some of the West with you. The landscape changes slowly. Open grasslands give way to towns, rail lines, farms, harbors, and eventually the familiar green of Long Island. At Oyster Bay the air feels different. Salt reaches you from the water. Trees soften the edges of the road. Summer insects hum in the grass and distant sails move across the sound. Ahead on a wooded rise stands the house that will become the true center of Roosevelt's private world. It is called Sagamore Hill. Theodore had begun planning the house before his first wife Alice died. He originally imagined it as a family home for the life he expected to build with her. History changed that plan. By the time the house is ready for regular family life, Edith is beside him instead. That quiet fact gives Sagamore Hill an emotional complexity that is easy to overlook. It is both a new beginning and a house whose earliest plans belong partly to a vanished future. You approach along the drive. The building does not appear delicate. Its broad shape sits comfortably among the trees, designed less as a showpiece than as a place meant to be lived in. Wood brick dark shutters, verandas, chimneys, and deep windows give it a solid, practical presence. Theodore wants space. He will need it. Children, relatives, friends, political associates, naturalists, writers, hunters, diplomats, and unexpected visitors will eventually pass through these doors. But before all that, Sagamore Hill becomes a family house. You step inside. The smell changes immediately. Wood polish, paper, leather, perhaps smoke from a fireplace in colder weather. The faint outdoor scent carried in on boots and coats. Books appear almost everywhere, not arranged merely to impress visitors. They are used, pinned, moved, stacked, returned to shelves. Theodore has the habit of turning any comfortable room into a reading room simply by entering it with a book. Edith brings more order. This becomes one of the household's defining balances. Theodore collects experiences. Edith organizes the life that makes those experiences possible. You move deeper into the house. Furniture is sturdy. Rooms feel full rather than sparse. Objects begin accumulating from Theodore's travels and outdoor life. Animal heads and skins eventually appear beside books, paintings, family photographs, and ordinary domestic furnishings. Modern visitors may find the hunting trophies startling. In Theodore's own time, they carry several meanings at once. They represent travel, natural history, sport, memory, status, and increasingly a complicated relationship with the wild landscapes he will later work to protect. The contradiction is visible on the walls. A man can admire an animal deeply and still live within a hunting culture that treats collecting it as part of understanding nature. Roosevelt's later conservation ideas grow partly from this world. At Sagamore Hill, you can almost watch those different attitudes sharing the same room. Then you hear running upstairs. The house is beginning to fill with children. Alice, Theodore's daughter, from his first marriage, becomes part of the family household. Then come Theodore Jr., Kermit, Ethel Archibald, and finally Quentin. 6 children in total will pass through Sagamore Hill under Theodore's roof. The quiet house you first entered does not remain quiet for long. Doors open. Someone calls down the staircase. A child races outside without the amount of preparation an adult might prefer. Another child returns carrying something muddy. A dog may appear. A disagreement begins. Then it is forgotten. Edith manages all of this with remarkable discipline. Household records and family recollections show her as careful with money, organized and protective of privacy. She does not want Sagamore Hill to become merely an extension of Theodore's public life. It must remain a home. That boundary becomes harder to maintain as his career grows. For now, however, you can still imagine ordinary mornings when the family gathers without reporters waiting outside. Breakfast brings everyone into orbit around the same table. Theodore may already have been awake for hours. Perhaps he has read. Perhaps he has taken a walk. Perhaps he has written letters. His children learn early that their father possesses an unusual amount of energy before most people are fully awake. He enjoys their company. He also expects them to be active. Outdoors, the property becomes an enormous playground. There are fields, trees, paths, water nearby. Children can row, climb, swim, ride, explore, and invent games that become increasingly elaborate. Theodore joins them often. He does not seem to believe fatherhood requires observing childhood from a comfortable chair. If the children climb, he may climb. If they race, he may race. If they explore a path, he's interested in where it goes. This creates wonderful memories. It also creates occasional accidents. The Roosevelt household accepts scrapes and torn clothing with a tolerance that would make some other families uneasy. Nature is not something viewed politely through glass. You go outside with them. Grass brushes your ankles. The afternoon smells of warm leaves and salt water. A horse shifts in a nearby stable. Somewhere below, the sound of the bay reaches the hill faintly. Theodore pauses when he notices a bird. Even though surrounded by children, conversation, and household activity, the old childhood naturalist remains alert. He identifies species. He listens to calls or points things out. His children grow up in a home where noticing the natural world is treated almost as an everyday duty. One unusual feature of Sagamore Hill is how thoroughly Theodore's interests enter the physical space. Objects are not hidden away simply because they are strange. Natural specimens, hunting, souvenirs, books, gifts, and artifacts become part of ordinary family surroundings. A child can grow up beside reminders of Africa, the American West Europe, and distant seas without leaving the house. The home becomes a kind of private museum. Unlike Theodore's childhood museum, however, this one has no neat boundary. History spills into bedrooms and hallways. A trophy stands beside a chair. A book from one subject rests near an object from another continent. Visitors sometimes contribute still more. The house gathers layers. Exactly how each room looked at every point in Roosevelt's life is not always certain. Furniture moved. Objects were added. Rooms changed as children grew and family needs shifted. Later preservation allows you to see much, but a historic house can never perfectly freeze every ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That uncertainty makes the lived-in details more valuable. You imagine what cannot be preserved. Wet boots near a doorway, a forgotten book left open, children whispering after bedtime, the smell of breakfast drifting upstairs, a horse waiting outside while someone searches for a missing glove, Theodore laughing somewhere beyond the hall. These details disappear quickly from the historical record, yet they are what make Sagamore Hill a home rather than a monument, and Theodore seems happiest when the house is full. Guests can find him intensely sociable. He enjoys conversation at meals. He likes arguments when they remain friendly. He tells stories. He listens eagerly when someone has actually done something interesting. A naturalist describing birds may hold his attention. So may a traveller, soldier, rancher, writer, athlete, or explorer. The dinner table becomes another kind of library. People replace books. Theodore reads them with the same curiosity. Edith remains nearby, quietly controlling the pace of the household. She knows when meals must begin. She knows where guests will sleep. She knows which child needs attention. She knows when Theodore has enthusiastically invited more people than the practical arrangements comfortably allow. Without her, Sagamore Hill might become permanent, organized chaos. With her, it becomes something warmer, structured disorder. That may be the best way to understand the house. Theodore fills it. Edith steadies it. The children animate it. The landscape surrounds it. As evening comes, windows begin glowing across the darkening lawn. Inside, the family gathers again. Books wait beside chairs. Dinner conversations linger. Someone is laughing upstairs. An animal scratches near a door. Theodore is home. For all the distant places he will visit, this hill above Oyster Bay will remain the location to which his private life keeps returning. And tomorrow morning, when the household gathers around the breakfast table, you will discover just how much of Roosevelt's personality can be revealed by the simple business of beginning another family day. Section 9. Morning returns to Sagamore Hill with less ceremony than you might expect from the home of a future president. You hear the house before you fully wake. A door opens somewhere along the corridor. Floorboards answer with a quiet creak. Water runs into a basin. Outside, birds are already active in the trees, and the cool air coming from Oyster Bay carries the faint smell of salt grass and damp earth. Downstairs, breakfast is beginning. This is one of the simplest places to understand Theodore Roosevelt. Not behind a desk, not before a crowd, at a family table. By the time the children appear, Theodore may already have spent part of the morning reading, writing, or walking outdoors. He is rarely enthusiastic about wasting early hours. Morning seems to arrive as another opportunity. The rest of the household must somehow catch up. You enter the dining room. Light falls through the windows. Silverware makes small sounds against plates. Coffee gives the room a stronger scent. Bread, eggs, meat, fruits, or other ordinary breakfast foods appear depending on the season and household plans. There is nothing especially mysterious about the meal itself. The mystery lies in the conversation. Roosevelt does not treat breakfast as a silent preparation for the day. He talks. He asks questions. He tells stories. He listens to reports from his children. Someone mentions an animal. Someone describes a plan for the afternoon. Someone may have misbehaved. Someone certainly has an opinion. The table becomes lively very quickly. Theodore enjoys being surrounded by family activity, and he does not appear to require children to become miniature adults simply because they are eating with him. He expects manners, but he also enjoys spirit. That distinction matters. His children grow up knowing that enthusiasm will usually receive a warmer response than dull obedience. They are encouraged to read, explore, ride, swim, walk, and pay attention to the natural world. At breakfast, yesterday's adventures can become today's family stories. You notice Edith nearby. Her presence changes the rhythm. Where Theodore tends to expand a conversation, Edith can quietly bring it back toward practical matters. Lessons must happen. Clothing must be found. Visitors may be expected. A child cannot spend the entire morning explaining an animal discovered near the stable. Meals need endings. Edith provides them. Her management of the household is careful and often economical. The Roosevelts are comfortable, but Edith does not behave as though money should be scattered carelessly, simply because Theodore's public position grows more important. She keeps track. She plans. She watches expenses. This practical discipline helps Sagamore Hill remain a functioning family home rather than a stage set built around Theodore. Breakfast therefore reveals two forms of energy. His is expansive. Hers is organizing. The children live between them. At some point, coffee reaches Theodore. He is known throughout his life as a devoted coffee drinker, and family memories often emphasize the strength and quantity he preferred. Exact accounts vary as family stories are. Some later anecdotes make his cup sound almost impossibly large. You should treat the most colorful versions gently. What seems much more certain is that coffee belonged comfortably within Roosevelt's daily routine. The detail suits him. A quiet cup seems almost incapable of remaining quiet in his hands. Her drinks while conversation continues. Perhaps a newspaper is nearby. Perhaps a book waits on another chair. Roosevelt is capable of giving full attention to a meal and still appearing ready to move toward the next activity immediately. Then there are the children themselves. Alice, the eldest, possesses a sharp wit and independent character. Theodore Jr. feels the particular weight of carrying his father's name. Kermit is thoughtful and adventurous. Ethel often seems steadier. Archie and Quentin bring younger energy into the household. Each relationship with Theodore develops differently. That is easy to forget when the family is remembered as one cheerful group. Parents never experience 6 children in precisely the same way. Temperaments clash. Expectations differ. Affection takes different forms. Breakfast is one of the places where these differences quietly appear. A child may tell a story. Another listens. Someone tries to attract Theodore's attention. Someone else may prefer Edith's calmer presence. There are jokes. There are correction. Occasionally there are disputes. Nothing about the family requires constant harmony. That is what makes it believable. Theodore seems to enjoy teasing. His children tease him in return. He gives them affectionate nicknames, writes playful letters, and sometimes illustrates those letters with simple drawings when the family is separated. This playful side belongs far more naturally at a breakfast table than in a formal portrait. You can almost hear the children laughing at something that would make little sense to anyone outside the family. Private households develop their own language. A nickname accumulates as history. A repeated joke needs no explanation. A look across the table can finish at a sentence. Most of these small codes disappear when the people who use them are gone. Letters preserve some. Memoirs preserve others. The rest vanish with the room. After breakfast, the family day begins breaking into different directions. The children have lessons or outdoor plans. Edith turns us towards her household responsibilities. Theodore may have writing to finish correspondence to answer visitors to receive or some physical activity already waiting. But he does not always leave the table emotionally. Family stories follow him. A child's question may become a subject discussed again later. An outdoor discovery may lead him toward one of his natural history books. A plan mentioned over a breakfast may become an expedition before afternoon. This is one of the curious things about living with Roosevelt. Conversation can become action very quickly. If someone wonders what lies beyond a particular trail, he may want to find out. If the children mention swimming, there is a reasonable chance he will join them. If weather seems unpleasant, that does not necessarily cancel the plan. Sometimes it improves it. Family recollections describe Roosevelt encouraging vigorous outdoor activity in conditions many parents would consider unsuitable. Rain does not automatically mean staying inside. Cold does not necessarily discourage a walk. Mud is treated as an inconvenience rather than a disaster. The children therefore learn that breakfast may be the calmest portion of the day. Even then, calm is relative. You notice another hidden habit. Roosevelt often uses meals to learn about people. When guests stay at Sagamore Hill, breakfast is not merely hospitality. It becomes inquiry. What has the visitor seen? What has the visitor read? Where has the visitor traveled? Does the visitor know something about birds, politics, literature, ranching, exploration, military life, or science? Theodore asks. Then he asks again. A guest who gives an interesting answer may discover that breakfast has become an informal examination conducted by a man who is genuinely delighted by expertise. He can dominate conversation, certainly, but he also values people who bring something new into the room. That curiosity gives the table unusual variety. A writer might sit where a rancher sat before. A naturalist may be followed by a diplomat. A family friend arrives. A child interrupts everyone. The household absorbs them. When Theodore later occupies the White House, this same tendency will follow him. Meals will remain places where official and private worlds overlap. Yet Sagamore Hill provides the original rhythm. Here there is no need to pretend every morning is historically important. Many are simply mornings. That is precisely why they matter. You see Theodore reach for another piece of bread. You hear a chair shift. Someone has already begun thinking about the day outside. Sunlight has strengthened across the lawn. The cool freshness of dawn is disappearing. Soon the doors will open and the family will scatter into the property. Before long, Theodore Roosevelt's household will become famous for something even less predictable than its breakfast conversation. Animals. They will appear in bedrooms, gardens, stables, letters, family stories, and eventually the White House itself. And some of them will behave far better than the children. Others will not. Section 10. You leave the breakfast table just as the household begins to scatter. Doors open toward the lawn. Children disappear upstairs and outside. A dog crosses the hall with complete confidence. Somewhere beyond the windows, a horse stamps impatiently near the stable. For a few more years, this noisy world remains centered at Sagamore Hill. Then Theodore Roosevelt becomes president in September 1901 after the death of President William McKinley. Roosevelt suddenly finds himself responsible for an office he had not expected to inherit so soon. You might imagine that entering the White House would transform his private life into something formal and restrained. Instead, much of the Roosevelt household simply moves with him. The children are all kids on me. So do the noise games, animals, arguments, muddy clothing books, and unpredictable interruptions that have always followed them. The White House changes immediately. You enter through one of its quieter corridors and hear running somewhere above you. This is not the measured sound of officials approaching a meeting. These are children. Roosevelt's younger sons, especially Archie and Quentin, help turn the presidential residence into something closer to an enormous family playground. The building itself invites imagination. There are staircases, loo halls, rooms that seem unusually large to a child, doors leading toward offices adults consider important. Outdoor grounds provide still more space. It's difficult to imagine a better setting for inventive mischief. The children race through corridors. They organize games. They recruit friends. They explore corners that earlier presidential families may have treated with far greater dignity. Roosevelt does not always discourage them. He remembers his own childhood vividly. Perhaps because illness once limited him, he seems especially pleased to watch healthy children use their bodies freely. Running is encouraged, climbing is admired, outdoor activity is treated almost as part of education. A child with torn clothing is preferable to one who has spent the entire afternoon doing nothing. That philosophy creates memorable scenes. One of the best-known Roosevelt family traditions is the so-called obstacle walk. The idea is simple. Once the direction is chosen, you must continue toward the destination without avoiding whatever lies between you and it. A fence appears, you climb it, water interrupts the route. You cross it, rocks rise ahead. You go over them. The rule turns an ordinary walk into a physical puzzle. You can imagine how delightful this seems to the younger Roosevelts. You can also imagine how guests feel when they discover that a casual invitation to accompany the president outdoors has unexpectedly become a test of endurance. Theodore joins enthusiastically. There is mud on shoes. Branches catch clothing. Someone slips. Someone laughs. For a moment, the presidential title becomes almost irrelevant. He's simply a father playing with his children. The White House grounds offer room for other adventures. The children use the lawn. They keep pets. They ride. They organize games with friends. Quentin the youngest becomes especially associated with the playful disorder of these years. He is energetic, imaginative, and comfortable treating the White House as his home rather than a national monument. That difference matters. Visitors see marble, ceremony, and authority. Quentin sees stairs. Theodore often sees both. He understands the dignity of the office, but he also resists allowing official life to consume every private corner. Family meals continue. Bedtime still arrives. Illness still interrupts plans. Children still require discipline. Homework does not disappear because their father is president. Edith works carefully to preserve that distinction. She tries to create a household inside an institution that never truly sleeps. Servants move through the residence. Visitors arrive. Officials need access to Theodore. Messages appear. Formal dinners must be organized. The building contains private bedrooms and public responsibilities are separated by remarkably little distance. Edith becomes a guardian of boundaries. Family time must be protected. The children require routine. The house needs order even when the nation is demanding Theodore's attention. You notice how strange the geography becomes. A child may be playing only a short distance from a room where serious government business is underway. A door closes and the atmosphere changes. On one side, officials speak carefully. On the other, someone may be laughing. Theodore crosses between these worlds constantly. He can leave a meeting and enter family life almost immediately. Sometimes the transition is imperfect. His children learn that important people may suddenly appear. Important people learn that Roosevelt children may suddenly appear as well. One of the pleasures of these years is how often formality loses. A pet becomes involved. A child interrupts. A game continues longer than expected. The White House refuses to behave entirely like an office building. That does not mean Roosevelt is an endlessly permissive father. He expects courage, honesty, effort, and self-control. He can be demanding. He worries about character. He sometimes gives advice with the same force he brings to public speeches. His children therefore experience both sides of his personality and plays vigorously with them. He also expects much from them. Theodore Jr. as the oldest son feels this particularly strongly. Carrying his father's name creates an invisible comparison that can be difficult to escape. Roosevelt loves him deeply, yet the expectations surrounding strength and achievement are considerable. Kermit develops his own quieter personality. Ethel often appears more composed than her brothers. Archie and Quentin bring younger chaos. Alice, already growing into adulthood, occupies a very different position. Her relationship with Theodore is affectionate but complicated. She is clever, independent, and famously unwilling to become the quiet presidential daughter others might prefer. Theodore understands her spirit because much of it resembles his own. Managing it is another matter. A famous saying later attributed to him claims that he could either control Alice or govern the country, but not both. The exact wording and circumstances of the remark are difficult to establish with complete confidence. Like many family anecdotes, it survives because it feels perfectly suited to the personalities involved. Whether spoken exactly that way or not, the story captures something real. Alice is not easily managed. You see her moving through Washington society with confidence. She attracts attention. Newspapers follow her activities. This makes private family life harder to protect. The Roosevelt children are becoming public figures simply because of their surname. Theodore is not always comfortable with that. I wants them to develop as individuals rather than decorations surrounding his presidency. Yet the White House makes privacy almost impossible. Even ordinary youthful behavior can become news. Family stories can become national stories. Pets become famous. Games become anecdotes. A father's teasing remark can survive for generations. This creates another uncertainty for historians. How much of the cheerful Roosevelt White House remembered later reflects ordinary daily life, and how much comes from the especially entertaining stories that families chose to preserve? There must have been dull afternoons. There were disagreements. There were illnesses. There were moments when Theodore was too busy to play. There were evenings when Edith was exhausted. No household is permanently delightful. Yet enough independent memories survive to show that the basic picture is true. The Roosevelt White House was unusually lively. Children used it as a home. Theodore enjoyed their energy. Edith worked constantly to make the extraordinary setting feel ordinary enough for family life. You pause in an upstairs corridor near evening. The light has softened through the windows. Official visitors are beginning to leave. Somewhere downstairs papers are still waiting for the president. But another sound reaches you first. Children. Then laughter. Then hurried footsteps. Theodore turns toward the noise. For a few minutes the work can wait. And just beyond the corridor another member of the household is probably waiting too. Perhaps a dog. Perhaps a pony outside. Perhaps something far less expected. Because the Roosevelt children have not merely brought childhood into the White House. They have brought an entire animal world with them. Section 11. You follow the sound of movement through the White House corridor, expecting another child to appear around the corner. Instead, something smaller moves first. A guinea pig, then a dog. Somewhere outside a pony waits. The Roosevelt White House is not merely filled with children. It is filled with animals. This is one of the most charming parts of Theodore Roosevelt's private life, although it is also one of the easiest parts to exaggerate. Over the years, family stories, newspaper reports later, biographies and popular retellings have blended together into an almost mythical presidential menagerie. Some animals are well documented. Others belong to stories that became more colourful with repetition. You step carefully around that distinction as you enter the family rooms. Dogs are among the most constant companion. One of the best remembered is a small black and tan terrier named Skip. Skip had originally joined Roosevelt during an earlier period and later became part of the family household. Eyes small enough to move easily through rooms that seem enormous around him. You hear his claws clicking against polished floors. He follows people through doorways. He waits beneath furniture. When outside, he becomes part of the children's games and the family's energetic life. Another dog, Pete, is remembered for a much less peaceful personality. Pete is a bull terrier, enthusiastic and strong, and family accounts suggest that his behavior eventually becomes difficult enough to create serious problems. He reportedly chases and sometimes bites people. At some point, his conduct becomes too troublesome for continued residence at the White House. The story sounds almost comic when told generations later. For the person being chased by the president's dog, it may have felt considerably less amusing. Still, animals in the Roosevelt household are rarely ornamental. The children handle and the children handle them, feed them, carry them, talk about them, lose track of them, find them in inappropriate places. Pets become participants in family life rather than carefully displayed possessions. You soon encounter guinea pigs, several of them. Their names alone reveal the playful imagination of the children. Among those remembered are Admiral Dewey de Johnson Bishop Doane, Fighting Bob Evans and Father O'Grady. The names borrow from famous people and public figures, transforming small domestic animals into characters in a private Roosevelt comedy. You can picture a child calling for a guinea pig whose name sounds more suited to a naval commander. Theodore seems to enjoy the joke, understands the pleasure of naming animals. His own childhood fascination with natural history has never disappeared, so the children's interest in living creatures feels entirely familiar to him. The difference is scale. His childhood museum contained carefully collected specimens. His own children prefer animals that move, and sometimes escape. You pass into another room and hear scratching from a cage. Birds also belong to the household. There are reports of parrots, small birds, and other creatures appearing at different times. The exact list varies depending on the source, partly because the Roosevelt children owned animals across several years and in more than one home. Popular retellings sometimes combine every animal ever associated with the family into a single crowded moment. Reality was probably less spectacular. Not every creature lived at the White House at once. That uncertainty is worth keeping. The truth remains wonderfully strange without improvement. There really were enough animals to make the presidential residence feel unusually alive. Then there is Algonquin. Algonquin is a pony belonging to Archie Roosevelt. The story most people remember occurs when Archie becomes ill. According to the family tradition, the children decide that the pony should visit him. A White House elevator makes the plan possible. You imagine the scene carefully. A pony approaches an elevator designed for people. Adults become concerned. Children become determined. Someone persuades the animal to enter. The doors close. Up it goes. When they open again, Algonquin is brought toward Archie's room. The story has survived because it perfectly captures the Roosevelt household's mixture of affection and complete disregard for ordinary expectations. Whether every detail was exactly as later remembered is difficult to prove. But the pony itself was real, and the story circulated close enough to the family to become one of the defining images of their White House years. You can almost smell the stable air briefly entering an elegant corridor. Hey, leather, warm animal breath. Perhaps someone nearby looks at the polished floor and wonders what will happen next. The children are thinking about Archie. That is all that matters to them. Theodore's reaction to such adventures is often indulgent. He dislikes cruelty and expects animals to be treated properly, but he is usually sympathetic towards curiosity. A creature entering an unusual room is not automatically a disaster. It may simply become tomorrow's story. Snakes appear in those stories too. One of the Roosevelt children, Quentin, is associated with bringing a small snake into the White House. In one frequently repeated version, the animal is carried into a formal setting and shown to adults who are considerably less delighted than Quentin. The details differ depending on the telling. That is typical of household folklore. Children remember the animal. Adults remember the interruption. Later writers remember whichever version is funniest. You move outside before another creature can escape from somewhere unexpected. The White House grounds provide room for horses. Roosevelt himself is an enthusiastic rider, and riding forms an important part of his daily exercise. The children's ponies therefore belong naturally within family life. Stables carry the familiar smells of hay, leather, wood, and animals. Hooves strike packed ground. Grooms move between stalls. A saddle is lifted into place. Theodore often looks more comfortable here than in a reception room. Animals offer a form of companionship without ceremony. A horse does not care that he is president. It responds to balance, confidence, hands, and voice. That simplicity seems to appeal to him. The children grow up with similar comfort around animals. Pets become a way of learning responsibility. They also create disorder. Food must be supplied. Cages must be cleaned. Doors must remain closed when necessary. Someone must notice when an animal is missing. You can imagine Edith evaluating all of this with greater caution than Theodore. She appreciates animals, but she also understands carpets, schedules, guests, servants, and the practical consequences of allowing children unlimited zoological freedom. Her role again becomes one of quiet containment. Theodore celebrates enthusiasm. Edith makes enthusiasm livable. Among the strange animals associated with the family are a badger named Josiah, and various unusual creatures given to the children or encountered during Roosevelt's travels. Josiah entered the family after Roosevelt received the young badger during a Western trip. The animal eventually became associated particularly with Archie. Keeping a badger as a pet is not especially convenient. That sentence alone tells you much about the Roosevelt household. Yet Roosevelt seems fascinated by the experience. He watches the animal's behavior. The naturalist returns. What another parent might see as an impractical pet, Theodore can also see as an opportunity to observe a species closely. This does not mean the household understood animal care in the way you might expect today. Standards were different. Ideas about wild animals, captivity collecting, and domestic pets belong to another era. You should not turn the family into modern conservationists living a century ahead of their time. Their relationship with animals contains contradictions. Roosevelt hunts. He collects specimens. He keeps unusual creatures. He also becomes increasingly alarmed by the disappearance of wildlife and destruction of habitat. All these things can exist within the same person. Perhaps that complexity is more interesting than a perfectly tidy story. By evening, the animals begin settling along with the children. A dog curls somewhere near a chair. A cage grows quieter. The horses remain outside. The house smells again of supper paper, wood smoke, and polished furniture. Theodore passes through the room carrying a book. One of the children calls him back to look at something. He stops. For a moment, the president disappears completely. You see only the boy who once collected a seal skull in New York, and leans closer. He asks a question. The animal moves. The child laughs. And tomorrow the creatures will have to share the White House with an even more unpredictable force. The Roosevelt children themselves, who have discovered that presidential corridors can become racecourses, staircases can become adventures, and almost any respectable room can be turned into part of a game. Section 12. You leave the animals settling into their corners and follow a new burst of footsteps along the White House corridor. The sound grows louder. A door opens. Someone laughs. Then two children disappear around a corner before any adult can ask where they are going. The Roosevelt White House has become a place of games. To an official visitor, the building still represents ceremony, government, and carefully controlled movement. To the younger Roosevelt children, it contains something else entirely. Possibility. There are staircases to climb, new corridors to race through, rooms to hide near, gardens to explore, trees to climb, lawns broad enough for the games that continue until clothing is dirty and daylight begins to fade. You move through the house behind them. Polished floors reflect the afternoon light. Portraits look down from walls. Servants pass quietly between rooms. Then Archie or Quentin rushes through the scene and reminds you that this is also a family home. Theodore Roosevelt seems delighted by much of this energy. His own childhood had contained long periods when asthma limited what he could comfortably do. Watching his children run freely must have carried a particular pleasure. He encourages vigorous play. I wants them outdoors. I wants them comfortable with discomfort. Cold weather is not an automatic excuse. Rain is not a catastrophe. A scratched knee is usually treated as part of growing up. This philosophy turns ordinary family recreation into something more demanding. The Roosevelt children become famous for what the family calls point-to-point walks or obstacle walks. The rules are wonderfully simple. Choose a destination, then move toward it in as straight a line as possible. Do not politely avoid an obstacle simply because a road offers an easier alternative. If a fence stands in front of you, climb it. If a hedge blocks the way, push through. If a stream interrupts your path, cross it. If the ground rises sharply, go over it. You can already sense Theodore's influence. An ordinary walk is apparently not enough. It must become a small test. The children love these expeditions. Theodore joins them whenever time allows. You follow the group beyond the White House grounds, where branches catch against coats and wet grass darkens shoes. Someone reaches a fence. Over they go. A muddy bank appears. No one turns back. A stream waits below. I begin to understand why visitors occasionally regret accepting Roosevelt's invitations to exercise. Use the word walk in a generous sense. What begins as recreation can involve scrambling, climbing, balancing, and returning home in clothing that tells the entire story. There is nothing military about the activity. The mood is often playful, yet Theodore uses play to teach something. He wants his children to improvise. He wants them to keep moving when a plan becomes inconvenient. He wants physical difficulty to feel normal rather than frightening. This lesson appears repeatedly in the household. Games become disguised education. The White House itself offers indoor possibilities when weather keeps everyone closer to home. The children invent clubs. One of the best remembered is the White House Gang, a loose collection of Roosevelt children and their friends who share games, adventures, and a private sense of belonging. The exact membership changes. Childhood organizations rarely maintain perfect records. That is part of their charm. A club can be very important on Tuesday and nearly forgotten by the following week. Yet the idea survives. The presidential residence contains its own small republic of children. Rules are invented. Names are given. Secret plans emerge. Adults are informed only when necessary. You imagine whispers near a staircase. Someone has discovered a new route. Someone else has brought a friend. Quentin especially seems naturally suited to this kind of world. As the youngest son, he grows up with older siblings, setting examples that he can either follow or improve upon. He often chooses improvement. His imagination is lively. His confidence is considerable. And because he spends important childhood years inside the White House, he learns to treat extraordinary surroundings as completely ordinary. This creates some wonderfully strange scenes. A room that visiting dignitaries approach with caution may mean little more to Quentin than a place he has passed 100 times. A corridor with historical paintings becomes useful because it is long. A staircase becomes interesting because of where it leads. The distinction between monument and home exists mainly for adults. Children are far more practical. Theodore understands this better than many visitors. He does not want his children paralyzed by the importance of their surroundings. The White House belongs to the country, but for several years it is also where his family sleeps. So the children are allowed a degree of freedom, not unlimited freedom. Edith remains nearby. She expects order. Lessons matter. Meals happen on schedule. Public occasions require suitable behavior. The children cannot simply treat every official room as a playground whenever they please. That tension gives the household its rhythm. There are times for formality. Then the doors close. Shoes come off. Voices become louder. The family breathes again. One unusual detail comes from the children's inventive use of the building itself. They are remembered riding wheeled toys, racing through spaces, staging games, and turning the grounds into territory for exploration. Stories later describe almost endless mischief, but not every anecdote can be verified in exact detail. The White House attracted newspaper attention, and entertaining stories about the president's children spread easily. Some were true, some were improved. Others may have merged together over decades of retelling. Historians, therefore, face a familiar problem. The more perfectly a childhood story captures the Roosevelt family, the more carefully you sometimes have to examine it. Still, the overall picture is firmly established. The Roosevelt children made the White House unusually lively. Theodore encouraged active play. Visitors noticed. Staff remembered. Family members later wrote about it. You pause outside near late afternoon. The lawn glows in low sunlight. Washington air feels warm and slightly heavy. Leaves barely move. A ball rests near the grass. Someone calls from farther away. Theodore appears briefly free from his office. Almost immediately, the children pull him toward whatever game has developed. This is another hidden part of his presidency. Public schedules consume enormous amounts of his time, yet he repeatedly looks for ways to remain physically present in family life. He wrestles with the children. He walks with them. He rides with them when possible. He listens to their stories. He writes to them when separated. His letters sometimes include playful illustrations, simplified animals, or exaggerated scenes designed to make them smile. The drawings are not works of formal art. That makes them more revealing. A busy president takes time to add something silly to a family letter. You can picture a child unfolding the pair. The official handwriting becomes personal. A small sketch appears. The distance between Washington and wherever the child happens to be suddenly becomes shorter. This private tenderness complicates Roosevelt's reputation for relentless toughness. He wants his children resilient, but he also wants them amused. He can lecture them about character and then join their games with complete enthusiasm. He can expect courage while writing affectionate nicknames in letters. The contradiction is not really a contradiction at all. It is simply family life. You move back inside as evening begins. The corridors are quieter now. Children wash away dirt gathered during the afternoon. Clothing is changed. Dinner approaches. The White House slowly shifts from playground back toward household order. Outside the family rooms, official work continues. Messages arrive. Papers accumulate. Visitors wait. Theodore will return to all of it. But for another few minutes you can hear the softer sounds of home. A child asks a question. Another complains about something minor. Someone laughs at an old joke. Edith restores order without making the house silent. Theodore listens from nearby. Tomorrow his restless habits will carry you into another private room entirely. There will be gloves, heavy breathing, footwork, and the surprising discovery that even inside the White House, Theodore Roosevelt still finds time to box. Section 13. The next morning you follow Theodore Roosevelt away from the quieter family rooms and toward a space where another part of his private routine begins. The atmosphere changes almost immediately. You hear shoes shifting against the floor. Leather creaks. Someone laughs briefly, then settles into concentration. A pair of boxing gloves waits nearby. For Roosevelt, exercise has never remained a childhood remedy. It becomes a lifelong habit. Even after entering the White House, surrounded by schedules, visitors, papers, and responsibilities, he keeps looking for ways to test his body. Boxing is one of his favorites. The connection reaches back to his youth when his father encouraged him to strengthen the body that asthma had made unreliable. At Harvard, Roosevelt had continued boxing and entered competitions. I was determined rather than naturally graceful. That distinction follows him into adulthood. He does not need to be the most talented person in the room. Who wants the contest? Who wants the effort? Who wants the feeling of having used the body completely? Now in Washington, you watch him prepare. The room is practical. There is no grand audience. A trainer or sparring partner stands across from him. Roosevelt adjusts his gloves. His spectacles cannot remain safely on his face. Without them, the world becomes less distinct. That creates an unusual disadvantage. He's severely nearsighted. yet he still enjoys a sport in which another person is attempting to strike him. There is something unmistakably Rooseveltian about that choice. The first movements are careful. Feet slide, gloves rise, breathing settles into rhythm. Then the pace increases. Roosevelt presses forward. He has always preferred action to hesitation. His style reflects that temperament, eyes willing to absorb punishment if it allows him to continue attacking. A professional trainer might prefer greater patience. Roosevelt prefers enthusiasm. You hear the soft impact of gloves. Leather touches skin. Shoes turn against the floorboards. Sweat begins to darken his clothing. After several rounds, he's breathing hard and smiling. Exercise seems to empty his mind of everything else. For a short time, there are no appointments, no political arguments, no newspaper criticism, only movement. That may be part of the attraction. Yet boxing eventually gives Roosevelt a permanent reminder that enthusiasm has consequences. During his presidency, while sparring with a younger military aide, Roosevelt receives a blow to his left eye. The injury causes serious damage. He eventually loses much of the sight in that eye. Remarkably, he keeps the extent of the injury largely private. The public does not immediately learn that a president has damaged his vision during a boxing session inside the White House. Roosevelt himself later treats the event with almost casual acceptance. He stops serious boxing, but he does not stop exercising. That would be asking too much. You follow him toward wrestling instead. Wrestling offers another form of controlled struggle. Balance replaces punching. Grip matters. Weight shifts quickly. Roosevelt enjoys the direct physical puzzle of it. Again, he is not trying to become a professional athlete. He simply wants resistance. He likes discovering where his body gives way and where determination can compensate. This appetite extends far beyond indoor exercise. There is tennis. There are long walks. There is horseback riding. There are rowing and swimming. At Sagamore Hill, family outings often become tests of stamina. In Washington, Roosevelt searches for similar outlets between official duties. Sometimes he rides through the countryside. You join him on a cold morning. The horse's breath forms briefly in the air. Leather reins feel stiff in gloved hands. The road ahead is damp from overnight weather. Another rider may expect a pleasant excursion. That expectation rarely survives long. Roosevelt likes distance. He likes speed. He likes difficult ground. If rain arrives, the ride continues. If mud appears, it becomes part of the experience. People invited to exercise with him soon learn that the safest interpretation of his plans is to assume they will be harder than described. There is humor in this. A guest who politely accepts an afternoon walk may discover himself climbing a steep bank or crossing water with the president already disappearing ahead. Roosevelt finds such inconvenience refreshing. Not everyone agrees. His children understand the pattern better. They have grown up with it. They know that a family outing can involve wet clothing scratches and a return home much later than expected. Theodore calls it vigorous living. Edith may call for clean towels. There are limits, however, even if Roosevelt dislikes acknowledging them. His body carries old injuries. His eyesight is imperfect. He suffers illnesses. Age gradually changes. One of the hidden stories of Roosevelt's physical life is not that he was endlessly strong. It is that he repeatedly exercised despite being far less indestructible than his public image suggested. This creates risks, and sometimes pushes too hard. He does not always accept pain as useful information. A sore joint can become a challenge. Fatigue becomes something to defeat. The same quality that helped a sickly child develop confidence can become stubbornness in the adult. Historians still debate how much of Roosevelt's strenuous philosophy came from genuine enjoyment and how much came from a lifelong fear of returning to the weakness of childhood. The answer is probably impossible to measure. His own writings strongly celebrate effort, but private motivations rarely fit neatly into one explanation. Perhaps exercise brings pleasure. Perhaps it brings reassurance. Perhaps it allows him to feel control over a body that once frightened him. Perhaps all three are true. You watch him finish another session. The room has grown warmer. His breathing is heavier. A towel waits nearby. Someone offers a comment about the pace. Answers quickly. Even after exercise, he rarely becomes quiet for long. Then comes another curious contrast. He can leave a strenuous workout and move directly toward a desk. A book opens. A letter is dictated. A meeting begins. Physical exertion does not end the day. It prepares him for the rest of it. That rhythm surprises people around him. Most adults divide life into work and recreation. Roosevelt often treats recreation as another form of work, and work, strangely enough, can become recreation if the subject interests him enough. The result is a schedule that would exhaust many people simply by reading it. Still evenings bring occasional softness. At Sagamore Hill, he may sit with Edith. He may read. He may talk with the children. The body finally becomes still. For a while. Then someone proposes a walk for tomorrow. Theodore's attention brightens. Outside wind moves through the trees. The road beyond the house disappears into darkness. It leads towards the fields, woods, and country lanes. For Roosevelt, those roads are not empty spaces between destinations. They are invitations, and on the next quiet morning you will follow him into the saddle away from offices and drawing rooms where the private pleasure of movement becomes inseparable from the landscapes he loves. Section 14. You leave the boxing gloves behind and follow Theodore Roosevelt toward one of the places where he seems most comfortable. Outside. The morning is cool. A faint mist rests over the low ground and the road ahead is still damp from recent rain. Horses shift near the stable while leather tack is tightened and reins are checked. Roosevelt approaches with the familiar eagerness of someone preparing for something he considers both exercise and pleasure. For him, riding is never merely transportation. It is a way to think, a way to escape rooms, a way to measure distance with the body, and just as importantly, a way to return to the natural world that fascinated him as a child. You mount beside him. The first part of the ride is easy. Hooves strike the road in a steady rhythm. Cold air brushes your face. Nearby fields carry the smell of wet grass and turned soil. The countryside beyond Washington is quieter than the city behind you. Farmhouses appear between trees. Fences divide fields. Small streams cross the land. Birdsong rises from hedges and woodland edges. Roosevelt notices almost everything. A bird lifts from a branch. His head turns immediately. A distant shape moves across a field. He watches until he is satisfied he knows what it is. The old naturalist remains present even while the rider presses forward. He had first learned to ride seriously during his younger years, and his time in the Dakota Badlands strengthened the habit. Out west a horse had been essential. Now riding remains part of his private routine even when necessity has disappeared. He rides because he enjoys the physical conversation between horse and rider. Balance changes constantly. The animal responds beneath you. The ground determines the pace. Horse cannot be managed by enthusiasm alone. Roosevelt understands that even if enthusiasm still enters the equation generously, you leave the smoother road. The terrain becomes less predictable. Branches reach over the path. Mud thickens beneath the horses. A shallow stream appears ahead. No one suggests turning around. This is exactly the kind of obstacle Roosevelt likes. The horses enter the water. Cold spray rises around their legs. Stones shift beneath the surface. On the far bank the trail climbs sharply. I begin to understand why some of Roosevelt's companions considered his recreational rides exhausting. He does not seek the easiest route. He often seeks the more interesting one. And to Roosevelt, interesting frequently means difficult. There is a quiet philosophy beneath this habit. He believes that physical discomfort builds resilience. Rain, cold, rough ground, and fatigue are not necessarily problems to be eliminated. They are experiences to be absorbed. That belief was shaped partly by his own childhood struggle with illness. It also reflects a broader culture of 19th century ideas about masculinity, character, and self-discipline. Roosevelt embraces those ideas more enthusiastically than most people, at times almost too enthusiastically. The weather begins to shift. Clouds gather. A light rain touches your coat. Another rider might suggest shortening the route. Roosevelt looks pleased. He has always regarded unpleasant weather as a kind of bonus. Rain makes the landscape smell stronger. Leaves darken. The soil softens. Streams grow louder. Clothing becomes heavier. Roosevelt seems to enjoy the fact that the ride now requires more effort. You continue. There are moments when the group spreads out. Conversation becomes difficult across the distance. That creates stretches of silence. The only sounds are hooves, rain, breathing, and the movement of branches. Roosevelt does not appear uncomfortable with that silence. Public memory often presents him as permanently talking. He certainly can talk with astonishing energy. Yet outdoor life gives him another rhythm. Her watches, her listens, her becomes absorbed in the landscape. This is especially true when birds appear, or trees, or signs of wildlife. Nature gives him subjects that do not require speeches. You read beside a stand of woodland. The air feels cooler beneath the trees. Wet bark gives off a deep earthy smell. Water slips from leaves. Briefly. Perhaps he has heard a call, and looks upward. For a few moments, the President of the United States is simply a man trying to identify a bird. That image matters. His private love of nature is not confined to grand expeditions. It exists in small pauses, a species recognized from its song. A track in mud, a flowering plant beside a road, a change in season. He carries this habit through much of his life. Later, when people remember Roosevelt as one of the great conservation presidents, they often focus on national parks, forests, wildlife refuges, and public policy. But those actions grew partly from thousands of quiet observations like these. A landscape first has to matter personally. Roosevelt spent decades allowing landscapes to matter. The countryside around Washington gives him temporary relief from official life. So does Oyster Bay. At Sagamore, hill riding routes connect the house with woods, roads, fields, and shoreline, and travels them with family members and guests. Some companions are strong riders. Others discover too late that an invitation from Theodore Roosevelt may contain hidden expectations. There are stories of guests returning exhausted after what they had imagined would be a moderate outing. Theodore often seems genuinely surprised by this. His own scale for ordinary exertion is unusual. If he can continue, he assumes the day is progressing well. This creates subtle comedy within the household. Edith understands the pattern. She has spent years watching her husband turn recreation into endurance. She knows that estimated return times are flexible. She also knows that Theodore may come home soaked, muddy, scratched, delighted, and ready to discuss dinner as though nothing unusual has happened. The children inherit some of this spirit. They ride, they hike, they swim. They learn to treat bad weather with less concern than many families would. Theodore's enthusiasm becomes part of their normal childhood. Not all of them enjoy every activity equally. That detail is important. The Roosevelt family is not a collection of smaller Theodores. Each child develops different tastes and temperaments. Some share his love of adventure more strongly. Others respond with greater restraint. The surviving family memories often emphasize the amusing outings, but there must also have been days when someone simply did not want to go. History preserves the exceptional day more easily than the ordinary refusal. That uncertainty leaves room for a more human household. Not every Roosevelt adventure ends in laughter. Sometimes there is fatigue. Sometimes irritation. Sometimes wet clothing feels exactly like wet clothing. You read onward. The rain begins to ease. Clouds break slightly in the west. Late light reaches across the fields. The landscape brightens in patches. Water shines briefly along the road. Roosevelt turns toward home. The return journey has a different mood. Effort has already been spent. Conversation becomes easier. Someone tells a story. Roosevelt answers with another. The horses know the direction and settle into a steadier pace. Soon the roofs of familiar buildings appear. At Sagamore Hill, lamps are beginning to glow. Smoke rises from a chimney. The smell of dinner will soon reach the hallway. Boots will be removed. Wet coats will be hung to dry. For a while, Theodore's body will finally stop moving. But his mind will not. A book will almost certainly be nearby. That is one of the quiet patterns you keep returning to. Roosevelt moves through the world physically, then returns to understand it through reading. The horse carries him across roads. Books carry him far beyond them. You step inside with him. Warm air replaces the cold. The rain continues softly against the windows. A chair waits near the lamp. So does a book. And as Roosevelt reaches for it, you begin to see that reading is not simply one of his hobbies. It may be the most constant private companion he ever has. Section 15. You step out of the damp riding clothes and into the warm interior of Sagamore Hill. Rain taps lightly against the windows. A fire settles in the grate. Somewhere deeper in the house, dishes are being prepared for the evening meal, while footsteps move along the hall with the familiar rhythm of family life. Theodore Roosevelt reaches for a book. This transition happens so naturally that after a while you stop finding it surprising. A long ride can be followed by several chapters. A difficult day can end with poetry. A railway journey becomes an opportunity to finish a novel. A few unexpected minutes before an appointment are enough to open another volume. Roosevelt reads almost everywhere, and he reads quickly. That habit begins in childhood, but by adulthood, it has become one of the defining features of his private life. You find him beside lamps. You find him in trains. You find him aboard ships. You find him in camps and hotels. Books accompany him into places where many people would bring only practical luggage. Yveton Bourg, even when he travels into rough country, printed pages remain close. The contrast is wonderfully Rooseveltian. A saddle may be resting nearby. Boots may be covered in mud. A rifle may have been used earlier in the day. And beside all of this lies a volume of history fiction, poetry, science, or biography. Theodore does not seem troubled by the mixture. For him, books and outdoor life belong together. One gives him experience. The other gives him language for experience. You watch him settle into a chair. The room gradually disappears around him. This is one of the rare ways Roosevelt can become physically still without seeming restless. His eyes move rapidly across the page. He turns it, then another. Visitors sometimes find his reading speed difficult to believe. Later accounts occasionally give enormous numbers for the books he supposedly finishes. A's with many stories surrounding Roosevelt exact totals should be treated carefully. Memory tends to polish remarkable habits. Yet the basic fact is secure. I was an exceptionally active reader throughout his life. The quantity of his correspondence, references, reviews published, writing and surviving library makes that clear enough. He does not simply own books. He uses them. That difference becomes visible throughout Sagamore Hill. Shelves are not arranged as decoration. Volumes are handled. They travel between rooms. Some are discussed at meals. Others become subjects of letters. Theodore recommends books to friends and family members with the confidence of someone who assumes reading should naturally be shared. You can imagine receiving one of his suggestions. He does not merely say that a book is good. He may explain why. Then he may compare it with another. Before long, one recommendation has become 5. The same enthusiasm that sends him over fences also sends him through libraries. His tastes are broad. History fascinates him. So does natural science. He reads novels especially when they offer strong characters or vivid worlds. Poetry matters deeply to him. He reads about military history, exploration, politics, animals, religion, and ancient civilizations. I is not interested only in books that agree with him. Argument seems to energize him. A writer who annoys Roosevelt can still hold his attention, perhaps especially then. You see him pause over a sentence. His expression changes. He may disagree completely. The book stays open. This is another important detail. Roosevelt reads actively. He compares claims against what he already knows. He thinks about the author's character. He asks whether descriptions fit his own experience. He wants books to participate in conversation. Sometimes that conversation becomes literal. At dinner, a topic from his morning reading can suddenly appear. Guests may find themselves discussing a historian they have not read. Theodore has. Then another title enters the discussion, and another. The table begins feeling less like dinner and more like a traveling library. His children grow up inside this atmosphere. Reading is not treated as a solemn school exercise. It is normal household activity. Books lie around. People talk about them. Stories are read aloud. Family members exchange opinions. Theodore especially enjoys literature that can be shared. At quieter moments, he reads to the children or discusses books with them. You can picture an evening after outdoor activity. Hair is still damp from washing. The youngest children are becoming tired. Edith sits nearby with her own reading. Theodore begins a passage. His speaking voice, so energetic in public, now belongs to the room. The scene reveals another part of his private character. He likes words, not only information. Words themselves, rhythm, phrases, a memorable line, a good description. He writes constantly too, and perhaps one habit strengthens the other. Roosevelt eventually produces an enormous body of published work, including histories, biographies, essays, hunting narratives, accounts of the West, political writing, and autobiography. But before the writing becomes public, it is fed by private reading. Books refill him. Then experience interrupts. Then he writes again. The cycle continues for decades. One unusual feature of his reading is his ability to absorb books in imperfect conditions. He does not always need an isolated study. Noise may surround him. Children may be nearby. Travel may be uncomfortable. A train rocks. A ship moves. Camp life offers poor light. Still Roosevelt reads. Perhaps growing up in a busy household trained him for this. Sagamore Hill certainly does not offer complete silence. There are dogs, children, visitors, doors, meals, outdoor plans. Yet Theodore can create a small private space simply by opening a book. I begin to see why reading remains with him during the periods of stress. Public life brings criticism. Political alliances change. Friends disappoint him. Family worries accumulate. Physical injuries limit him. Books offer continuity. A person who lived centuries earlier cannot suddenly demand an appointment. A novel does not care about newspaper headlines. A familiar poem waits exactly where you left it. That predictability has its own comfort. Still, historians cannot know precisely what Roosevelt experienced internally while reading. His letters reveal preferences. His writings reveal influence. Family memories describe the habit. But the emotional function of reading remains partly private. Was it escape, preparation, pleasure, compulsion? Perhaps all of them at different times. A person can read the same book for different reasons on different evenings. You look around the room. The rain has weakened. Outside drops fall occasionally from the leaves. Inside, the fire has burned lower. Roosevelt is still reading. Someone enters. He marks the place, listens, responds, and then returns to this page. That small motion happens countless times across his life. Close. Listen. Answer. Open again. Even during the presidency, when official papers fill his days, he finds room for personal books. Reading becomes an act of private independence. The government may control much of his schedule. It cannot entirely choose what occupies his imagination. That freedom matters. Years later, when public office is behind him, books remain. Titles change. The body slows somewhat. The shelves do not. At Sagamore Hill, his library continues to represent a lifetime of appetite. Not the appetite of a collector who wants untouched volumes. The appetite of someone who wants to enter them. By now evening has deepened beyond the windows. The horses have settled. The children are quieter. Edith has restored the household to its nighttime rhythm. Roosevelt closes the book at last. Tomorrow another pile of letters will be waiting. Some will be serious, some affectionate, some impatient, some playful, and in those pages written by his own hand you will discover a voice very different from the one preserved in public speeches. There will be nicknames, drawings, family jokes, instructions, worries, and moments of tenderness that history almost lost in the margins. Section 60. You remain beside the closed book for only a moment. Soon another kind of paper takes its place. Letters. They are everywhere in Theodore Roosevelt's private life. Letters to children. Letters to Edith. Letters to sisters. Letters to friends. Letters written from trains, hotels, camps, government offices, and quiet rooms at Sagamore Hill. Some are serious. Others are wonderfully playful. Through them the public Theodore Roosevelt begins to soften around the edges. You no longer hear only the energetic speaker remembered by crowds. You hear a father asking about a child's health, a husband describing his day, a traveller explaining what he has seen, a man missing home. The household has its own private language and nicknames appear constantly. Theodore himself had been called Teddy as a child. His sister Anna remained Bamie within the family. His children also collected affectionate names and shortened forms that rarely appeared in formal public life. These names matter because they reveal intimacy. A newspaper may print Theodore Roosevelt. A family letter does not need to. Inside private correspondence, everyone already knows who everyone is. You sit beside Roosevelt while he writes. The room is quiet except for the movement of the pen. Perhaps rain presses softly against the windows. Perhaps summer insects sound beyond the screens. His handwriting moves quickly. He has many things to say. Roosevelt writes with an energy that resembles his conversation. One subject leads naturally into another. A family question becomes a description of an animal. A description of an animal becomes a joke. Then comes advice. Then another observation. The letter grows. When writing to his children, Roosevelt often meets them at their own level rather than speaking down from the position of a distant father. I tell stories. I describes adventures. He asks about their activities. And sometimes he draws pictures. These simple sketches are among the most charming surviving objects from his family life. You can imagine a child receiving an envelope and opening it carefully. Inside are words from father. Then between the lines or beneath them appears an animal. Perhaps a bird. Perhaps some creature involved in the story. The drawing is not polished. That is precisely why it feels intimate. Roosevelt is not trying to create art for preservation. He is trying to make a child smile. A strange animal seen during travel becomes easier to explain with a quick sketch. A joke becomes funnier when given a face. A family story suddenly has a picture beside it. The public world rarely leaves room for this Theodore. Presidential portraits require stillness. Political cartoons exaggerate his teeth, glasses, and forceful personality. But his own little drawings belong to another world entirely. They were made for specific eyes. His children's. You follow one letter away from Washington. When Roosevelt travels, correspondence becomes a bridge back home. Distances that now seem easy can feel much greater in an age before telephone communication becomes ordinary within family life. A letter carries more weight. You cannot send a quick sentence and receive an answer moments later. You write what matters. Then you wait. For Roosevelt, who dislikes waiting in almost every other part of life, correspondence requires unusual patience. He sends the letter. Trains carry it. Postal workers sort it. Someone at home eventually receives it. Only later can a reply begin travelling back. That delay gives letters a particular tenderness. A person must imagine what home looks like while writing. Roosevelt can be surrounded by a completely different landscape and still picture Sagamore Hill. He knows the rooms, the porch, the library, the paths outside. He knows where Edith may be sitting. He can imagine which child will open which letter. The house becomes portable through memory. Edith's letters matter differently. Their marriage has always depended partly on periods of separation. Political work takes Theodore away. Travel takes him farther. Hunting trips and expeditions can separate them for longer still. In letters, between husband and wife, grand history often disappears. Practical life returns. Health, children, visitors, travel arrangements, money, plans, small worries, the ordinary fabric of marriage. Roosevelt's affection for Edith comes through strongly across the years. Yet their correspondence also reflects two distinct personalities. He tends toward expansion, tends toward control. He can describe a day with enormous enthusiasm. Edith may answer with sharper practical judgment. She knows how to keep the family functioning when Theodore's attention has travelled somewhere else entirely. That balance appears even on paper. Then there is Alice. The oldest daughter occupies a special and sometimes difficult place in Roosevelt's private world. Her mother, Alice Lee Roosevelt, has become almost absent from his later conversation. The daughter carries her name. That alone creates a quiet emotional complexity no surviving letter can fully explain. Young Alice grows independent, witty, socially daring, and unwilling to behave like a carefully arranged symbol of presidential respectability. Her father loves her. He also finds her difficult to control. Their exchanges can contain affection mixed with exasperation. That mixture feels more human than the simplified family stories that later generations often prefer. The same is true of his sons. Theodore writes advice. He encourages courage and effort. He worries about character. Sometimes the advice feels heavy. His children live under the gaze of a father who has turned self-discipline into a personal creed. Theodore Jr. especially knows what it means to carry both his father's name and expectations. Kermit receives his own mixture of affection and guidance. Archie and Quentin often encounter the more playful father. Ethel moves through the family with a steadier presence. Yet letters remind you that these relationships were always changing. A child at 9 is not the same person at 19. Neither is the father. You notice another important habit. Roosevelt writes quickly and often, and does not wait for perfect literary conditions. A letter may be composed after a long autumn day. Another may be squeezed between responsibilities. A third may come from a distant camp. This resembles his reading habits. Her use is available minutes. Time is something to fill. Even affection is given a place in the schedule. That sounds colder than it is. For Roosevelt, making time to write is one way of refusing to let distance weaken family life. He may be physically absent, and does not want to become emotionally absent as well. Historians benefit enormously from this habit. Letters preserve details that formal records ignore. What someone ate, which child was sick, what book Theodore was reading, which animal amused him, what weather delayed a journey, who annoyed him, who delighted him. Yet correspondence creates its own uncertainty. A letter records what the writer chooses to say. It does not record everything. Roosevelt may soften a worry to avoid frightening Edith. He may exaggerate a funny moment for the children. He may leave pain unwritten. The silence between letters matters too. You can never assume that what survives on paper is the entire private life. Still, the fragments are wonderfully rich. You picture Theodore at Sagamore Hill late in the evening. The house is quieter now. A lamp burns beside him. His hand moves across another sheet. A dog may be asleep nearby. Books surround the desk. Upstairs, the children's rooms are still. He finishes one letter and begins another. For a man remembered for speaking, he leaves an extraordinary amount of himself in writing, and sometimes that written voice is gentler than expected. The jokes are smaller. The worries are closer. The affection is less guarded. You fold the paper with him. The envelope closes. Tomorrow it will leave the house. But tonight it remains on the desk beside the books, the family photographs, and the little private traces that reveal Theodore Roosevelt more clearly than any podium ever could. Outside, the season is beginning to turn. Soon winter will gather around the White House. Lamps will glow earlier. Children will begin anticipating Christmas. And inside the Roosevelt household, another set of family traditions will emerge, half documented, half remembered, and quietly transformed by time. Section 17. The letter on Theodore Roosevelt's desk is folded, sealed, and ready to leave Sagamore Hill. Outside, the season has changed. The bright green of summer has disappeared from Long Island, and the trees surrounding the house now stand bare against a pale winter sky. Cold air comes from the direction of Oyster Bay, carrying the clean smell of salt and damp earth. Soon another Christmas approaches, and when you follow the Roosevelt family back into the White House during these winter weeks, you discover that even their holidays have acquired a mixture of tradition, noise animals, books, and stories that later generations will not always remember correctly. Washington looks different in December. The daylight fades early. Carriage lamps appear along the streets before dinner. Cold air follows visitors through doors, and fireplaces become more important throughout the presidential residence. Inside the family quarters, preparations begin quietly. Packages arrive. Letters accumulate. Children become increasingly interested in what might be hidden from them. Servants move through corridors carrying objects that suddenly seem suspicious to younger members of the household. Edith understands the seasonal excitement perfectly well. She also understands that 6 Roosevelt children can turn anticipation into chaos if allowed sufficient opportunity. So ordinary routines continue. Lessons remain. Meals happen. Public obligations cannot simply disappear because Christmas is approaching. For Theodore, presidential work also continues almost until the holiday itself. Documents still arrive. Officials still need decisions. Visitors still appear. Yet he tries to keep a portion of Christmas within the family. That is easier said than done inside the White House. A presidential holiday is never completely private. Newspapers want stories. The public wants to know how the family. Visitors are curious. Every small household detail risks becoming part of national folklore. One of the most famous examples concerns the Christmas tree. You may have heard the story that Theodore Roosevelt refused to allow Christmas trees in the White House because he believed cutting trees contradicted his conservation principles. The story is wonderfully neat, perhaps too neat. Later retellings often describe young Archie and Quentin secretly bringing a small tree into the house and hiding it inside a closet before surprising their father. It sounds exactly like something Roosevelt children would do. The problem is that historians have found the story much less certain than its popularity suggests. There is no strong evidence that Theodore imposed a formal ban on Christmas trees for conservation reasons. The family did not always use a large central Christmas tree because American Christmas customs were still varied during this period. Some households had trees, others arranged gifts differently. Tradition had not yet settled into the uniform pattern familiar in later generations. There may indeed have been a small tree prepared by the children during one Roosevelt Christmas, but the dramatic image of a conservationist president forbidding trees throughout the White House appears to have grown through repetition. You walk through the family rooms remembering that distinction. History likes stories that fit personalities. A president associated with forests seems naturally suited to banning Christmas trees. Mischievous Roosevelt children seem naturally suited to smuggling one upstairs. The combination is almost irresistible. Reality tends to be quieter, and perhaps more interesting. The Roosevelts celebrate Christmas primarily as a family holiday. Gifts are important, especially for the children. Books naturally appear among them. So do toys, clothing, outdoor equipment, and small personal objects chosen with knowledge of individual tastes. You can imagine Theodore studying a book he intends to give one of the children. A gift is never entirely separate from his interests. If the book concerns the natural history, adventure, poetry, or exploration, he may be almost as eager to discuss it as the child is to receive it. Morning arrives early. Very early if children have any influence over the schedule. You hear movement above you. A door opens. Then another. Whispering becomes footsteps. The Roosevelt children have already developed considerable skill at moving quickly through the White House, though quiet movement is less reliable. Soon the family gathers. Wrapping paper begins to accumulate. Boxes open. Someone calls across the room. Someone else has already become absorbed in a new possession. Theodore enjoys the atmosphere. Is not naturally suited to restrain celebration. A good gift produces enthusiasm. A joke deserves laughter. A child's delight is something to join rather than observe politely. The presidential residence briefly becomes indistinguishable from countless family homes celebrating the same morning. That ordinariness is easy to overlook. Beyond the doors, guards remain at their posts. Official communications continue. The building still belongs to the presidency. Inside, a child is examining a toy. Edith is watching the room. Theodore is probably talking. Breakfast follows. The smell of coffee rises again. Warm food replaces the sharper scent of winter air. Christmas meals during the Roosevelt years can include the substantial dishes expected in prosperous American households of the period. Roasted meats, vegetables, breads, sweets, and seasonal desserts appear across holiday tables. Exact menus vary and surviving accounts do not give you every plate from every year. That uncertainty protects the meal from becoming too perfect. You are not looking at a stage historical banquet. You are watching a household eat. Children have favorites. Adults continue conversations. Someone may want to leave the table before everyone else has finished. Theodore may begin discussing a book received that morning. Edith quietly keeps events moving. There are family visitors as well. The Roosevelts maintain strong connections with relatives, particularly Theodore's sisters and extended family. Our holiday can therefore stretch beyond the immediate household. Rooms fill with familiar voices. Old stories return. Nicknames are used. Children disappear with cousins or friends. The White House becomes temporarily less presidential and more Roosevelt. One of the quieter pleasures of the season comes later in the day. The pace slows. Winter darkness arrives early outside the windows. Firelight changes the rooms. Gas and electric lighting give the White House a warmer evening glow. The children settle after the morning's excitement. A new book may already be open. This is where Theodore's idea of family pleasure becomes especially visible. Reading can become part of the holiday. So can storytelling. A gift does not need to produce noise to be successful. Sometimes the best thing in the room is a story everyone already knows. You sit nearby while conversation moves between family memories and the day's small events. Theodore may remember Christmases from his own childhood. His father returns through those memories. So does his mother. The old New York house appears again in fragments. Perhaps this is one reason holidays carry such unusual emotional weight. They repeat. A meal resembles an earlier meal. A winter smell returns. A phrase spoken by someone long gone appears in another person's voice. Theodore rarely allows himself to dwell publicly on grief, especially the loss of his first wife. Yet family traditions create places where the past can return without being formally summoned. No diary can tell you precisely what he remembers during these evenings. That private territory remains closed. You can only watch the visible things. He stays near the children. He joins conversation. He opens books. He laughs. He writes holiday letters when family members are absent. He keeps moving even during celebration. Outside Washington becomes still beneath the winter night. A horse occasionally passes along the street. Cold air presses against the windows. Inside, the fireplaces burn lower. One by one, the younger children disappear upstairs. The animals settle. Wrapping paper has been cleared away. The official rooms beyond the family quarters grow quiet. Theodore remains for a while near the light. Perhaps a newly received book rests in his hands. Perhaps Edith is reading nearby. The excitement of morning has dissolved into something smaller and gentler. Christmas in the Roosevelt household is not remarkable because every tradition is unique. It is remarkable because a family living inside one of the most public houses in America keeps trying to make the day feel private. And soon the White House winters will become memories themselves. The children will grow. The presidency will end. Another summer will eventually bring you back to Oyster Bay, where Sagamore Hill waits beneath green trees and the family's happiest routines can stretch across long afternoons beside the water. Section K. Winter fades slowly from the White House, and with it the close rooms, early darkness, and holiday routines you have just watched. Now you follow the Roosevelt family back toward Long Island. Summer changes everything at Sagamore Hill. The house opens outward. Windows lift. Doors stand open longer. Warm air moves through the rooms, carrying the smell of grass, salt water, sun-warmed wood and leaves. Children spend more time outside than in. Theodore Roosevelt seems to prefer it that way. Sagamore Hill is not simply where the family sleeps between public duties. It is where family life expands. You step onto the veranda in the morning. Birds call from the trees. Insects hum over the lawn. Farther away, Oyster Bay glints beneath the sunlight. Someone is already planning to go down toward the water. Someone else has disappeared toward the stables. Theodore may have finished several pages of reading before most of the household is fully organized. Now he wants movement. Summer offers countless possibilities. There are walks. There is rowing. There is swimming. There are rides. There are games. There are visitors who sometimes discover that a restful stay at Sagamore Hill includes far more activity than expected. Theodore enjoys taking people outside. A guest may arrive imagining long conversations on a shaded porch. That may happen, but the conversation might continue while climbing a hill, or crossing a field, or following a path toward the shore. Theodore seems to believe that nearly every social occasion improves when movement is added. You follow the family down toward the water. The path changes under your feet. Dry ground becomes softer near the shoreline. Salt grows stronger in the air. Water moves gently against boats and pilings. The children know these places well. They have grown up exploring them. A small boat becomes another extension of the household. Theodore enjoys rowing and swimming, and the children are encouraged to become confident around water. The bay is not merely scenery. It is part of the playground. Oars enter the water. The wooden boat shifts slightly beneath you. Each stroke produces a soft splash. The shore begins to recede. Theodore looks entirely at ease. He may talk while rowing. He may point toward a bird. He may challenge one of the children. He may simply enjoy the rhythm. Water slows even him somewhat. Not completely, but somewhat. Swimming offers a different pleasure. Theodore has long believed in exposing the body to cold and discomfort rather than avoiding them. Cool water therefore becomes attractive rather than discouraging. Family accounts describe outdoor bathing and swimming as part of the Roosevelt world. The exact details vary with season, age, and location, but the pattern remains clear. If there is water nearby, Theodore is likely to consider entering it. The children learn that reluctance receives limited sympathy. Still, these outings are not military drills. There is laughter. People race. Someone splashes someone else. A child complains about the temperature and then goes in anyway. Theodore is often more amused than stern. He likes seeing courage when it emerges naturally. Afterward, towels feel rough against wet skin. Clothing smells faintly of salt. Hair dries in the sun. The group begins climbing back toward the house. Lunch waits. At Sagamore Hill, meals during summer can be lively and informal compared with official Washington dining. Children move in and out of the day. Guests arrive. Windows remain open. Outdoor smells mix with food from the kitchen. Theodore brings stories back to the table. A bird seen that morning becomes a topic. A route taken on horseback becomes another. A guest mentions a book. Immediately the conversation shifts. This is one of the pleasures of Sagamore Hill. Different parts of Roosevelt's life constantly overlap. Reading becomes conversation. Conversation becomes walking. Walking becomes natural history. Natural history becomes family education. Nothing stays in one category for long. The house itself carries this mixture. You pass through rooms crowded with books, furniture, photographs, hunting trophies, gifts, and objects collected over decades. Then you look outside and see children running across grass. Private history is everywhere, not because every object is historically important, because every object has been used. That distinction matters. A chair remembers someone sitting, a desk remembers letters, a porch remembers summer conversation, a path remembers thousands of ordinary steps. Theodore especially loves gathering people. Friends, relatives, writers, naturalists, public figures, and old companions come to Sagamore Hill. Some arrive for serious conversation, others simply visit. The household can become crowded quickly, so Edith remains the person who makes this possible. She keeps track of rooms, meals, servants, arrivals, departures, children, guests. She understands how many people can actually be fed. Theodore seems more interested in how many people might be interesting. This difference produces one of their familiar domestic balances. High invites, she organizes. High expands, she contains. And somehow the house continues functioning. You can imagine Edith standing near the entrance after learning that another guest is expected. Perhaps Theodore has mentioned it only recently. Perhaps not recently enough. She adjusts. Theodore continues smiling. That quiet household labor rarely appears in public accounts, but without it much of the celebrated Sagamore Hill hospitality would have been impossible. Afternoons lengthen. Heat settles over this property. Some family members retreat indoors. Shaded rooms offer relief. Theodore may read during this quieter period. The contrast with the morning is gentle. Hours earlier he was rowing or walking. Now he sits near an open window with a book. Leaves move outside. Of fly circles the grass. Somewhere down the hall a child is speaking too loudly. Roosevelt continues reading. The house does not need to become silent for him. Later activity returns. Perhaps there is tennis. Perhaps another ride. Perhaps children invent a game. Perhaps Theodore gathers everyone for one of his strenuous walks. The exact schedule changes. The rhythm does not. Movement. Food. Reading. Conversation. More movement. The summer days at Sagamore Hill seem almost designed for Roosevelt's temperament. They are full without being formal. That is important. Washington demands performance. Sagamore Hill allows habit. Here Theodore does not need to become presidential before breakfast. He can appear in practical clothing. He can walk outside without ceremony. He can stop to examine a bird without making anyone wait for an official event. He can spend time with his children without the same level of public attention. Not complete privacy. Reporters and visitors still know where he is, but enough privacy to breathe differently. I begin to understand why he returns here again and again. There are places people inhabit, and there are places that become part of their identity. Sagamore Hill becomes the second kind. Later, when Theodore travels far away, he often carries the house with him mentally. Letters return to it. Memories return to it. Family plans are built around returning. The rooms offer stability to a man who spends much of his life moving. Historians know a great deal about these summers through family letters, memoirs, surviving objects, and the house itself. Yet the most ordinary moments remain impossible to recover exactly. Which joke made everyone laugh on a particular afternoon? Which child refused to join a swim? Which guest quietly wished Theodore would stop suggesting another walk? Those details are gone. Gone. Perhaps that is appropriate. A home should keep some secrets. Evening finally settles over Oysters Bay. The heat begins to lift. The sky softens. Water beyond the trees catches the last light. The family gathers again. Someone sits on the veranda. A book closes. A chair scrapes gently across the floor. Theodore looks older now than the boy you first met in New York, but the habits remain recognizable. Nature still draws his attention. Books still wait nearby. Family still fills the house. And soon age itself will begin asking questions that Theodore Roosevelt has spent much of his life trying not to hear. How long can the body keep moving? How much adventure remains? What happens when children become adults and the house grows quieter? You stay beside him as another Sagamore Hill evening darkens, knowing that retirement will not bring him anything resembling true stillness. Section 19. You remain at Sagamore Hill as another summer evening settles over Oyster Bay. The house is still full of familiar objects. Books crowd the shelves. Animal trophies remain fixed above dark wood. Family photographs preserve younger faces. Outside the paths Theodore Roosevelt has walked for decades still lead toward fields, woods, and water. Yet something has changed. The children are growing older. Theodore is growing older too. He does not particularly enjoy admitting either fact. When he leaves the presidency in March 1909, he is only 50 years old. For many men, that might mark the beginning of a quieter stage of life. For Roosevelt, it becomes another beginning. Within weeks, he prepares to leave home again. This time Africa is waiting. The journey will become famous for hunting natural history, collecting specimens, and travel across vast landscapes. But you notice something more private before he departs. Leaving Sagamore Hill means leaving Edith. Again, she has spent years accepting that marriage to Theodore Roosevelt includes long separations. I is not a husband naturally inclined towards staying in one place. Travel calls to him. Work calls to him. Books lead toward places he wants to see. And once an expedition takes shape in his mind, resisting it becomes difficult. Letters once again become the bridge home. From far away, Roosevelt writes about landscapes, animals, companions, discomfort, and daily routines. He also asks about family. The pattern is familiar. Adventure outward, memory homeward. Even near surrounded by unfamiliar country, some part of him remains in Oyster Bay. After Africa comes Europe, then writing, then speeches, then political involvement again. Retirement refuses to behave as retirement. Roosevelt produces articles and books at a pace that would exhaust many younger writers. His desk becomes almost as important as the saddle. You see him working through stacks of paper. A pen scratches rapidly. Books remain close. Letters arrive. More letters leave. The house may be quieter than during the children's earliest years, but Theodore fills empty space with work. Then in 913, another extraordinary journey begins. This time he travels to South America. The expedition eventually takes him into the Brazilian interior, where he joins an effort to explore a river, then little known to outsiders. The trip becomes far more physically punishing than expected. Roosevelt is no longer the young rancher of the Dakota Badlands. His body carries years of injuries. His eyesight has already been damaged. He has accumulated the ordinary wear of age and the extraordinary wear of living, as though limits were invitations. In Brazil, those limits become impossible to ignore. The party travels through heat insects, difficult terrain, rough water, and illness. At one point, Roosevelt injures his leg badly. The wound becomes infected and develops fever. His strength declines. The man who spent decades insisting on physical endurance is now forced to confront a body that will not simply obey determination. This is one of the turning points of his later private life. He survives, but he does not entirely recover his former physical strength. When you follow him back to Sagamore Hill, he seems recognizably Theodore Roosevelt and yet subtly altered. There is still energy. There is still conversation. There are still books. But pain has become a more regular companion. His hearing troubles him. Old injuries return. His weight changes. Walking and exertion become more difficult than they once were. I dislike these limitations intense. The same philosophy that helped him challenge childhood weakness now makes accepting age especially difficult. You can almost feel his impatience. The path outside is still there. The horse is still there. The books still describe distant places. But the body that once answered every invitation has begun negotiating. Roosevelt does not stop moving. He modifies movement. He reads more. He writes. He receives visitors. He spends time with family. The house becomes increasingly important because the world no longer needs to be crossed physically for him to remain engaged with it. People come to him. Writers arrive. Political friends arrive. Naturalists arrive. Former companions return. Young people visit simply to meet him. Sagamore Hill becomes a destination. Theodore sits surrounded by objects from earlier journeys while stories of new ones enter through the door. And now there are grandchildren. This may be one of the gentlest changes of all. The father who once wrestled with his children becomes a grandfather watching another generation discover the same lawns, rooms, animals, and family jokes. A grandchild can enter Sagamore Hill without understanding the public weight of the name Roosevelt. To a small child, Theodore is not a former president. I is simply a grandfather with an enormous moustache, an expressive voice, and a remarkable supply of stories. You can imagine how unnaturally he fits the role. He enjoys children because they ask direct questions. They are curious without ceremony. They do not require political explanation. An animal story can satisfy them completely. A walk can become an adventure. A book can become a gift. He has spent his entire life practicing for conversations like these. Yet the household also carries increasing sadness. His children are adults now and their lives take them beyond Sagamore Hill. They travel. They marry. They face their own dangers. Theodore, who once seemed capable of protecting the family through sheer energy, must learn the helplessness of watching grown children make their own choices. The First World War deepens the anxiety. His sons serve. Letters again become precious. News from overseas is waited for carefully. The old family habit of correspondence now carries a more serious weight. Then comes the loss Roosevelt cannot outrun. In July 1918, his youngest son Quentin is killed while serving as a pilot in France. The boy who once filled White House corridors with mischief is gone. You do not need to describe the circumstances in detail. The silence at Sagamore Hill is enough. Theodore receives the news. The household changes. Edith grieves. The family gathers around absence. Roosevelt continues writing and speaking, but those close to him notice the blow. Exactly how deeply Quentin's death affected Theodore's final months can never be measured with precision. Friends and relatives believed it wounded him profoundly. His health was already declining. His body had been weakened by years of illness and injury. Grief joined an already heavy burden. Historians cannot separate those strands neatly. Perhaps no one should try. You walk through Sagamore Hill in late 1918. Winter returns. The rooms are quieter than they once were. There are no small children racing down the hallway now. The White House years feel distant. The Badlands feel farther still. Yet Theodore remains surrounded by continuity. His books, Edith, family photographs, letters, objects collected across a lifetime. The familiar chair, the familiar windows, the landscape outside. Even now he reads, even now he writes. That may be the most revealing detail. When physical adventure becomes difficult, intellectual movement continues. The boy who once escaped illness through books returns to them again in age. The circle is almost complete. At night, Sagamore Hill settles around him. Wood contracts softly in the cold. A fire burns lower. Wind moves through bare branches outside. The house that once struggled to contain his energy now seems large enough to hold his memories. Soon you will walk through these rooms one final time. Not as a museum visitor. Not yet. You will walk them while Theodore Roosevelt's presence still seems close enough to hear. And in the objects he leaves behind, you will discover that the private life of a famous man often survives most clearly in the ordinary things that remain after the footsteps stop. Section 20. You remain inside Sagamore Hill as winter settles more deeply over Oyster Bay. The house feels different now. Not empty. Never entirely empty. Books still crowd the shelves. Furniture still carries the impressions of ordinary use. Photographs remain in their frames, and objects gathered across decades continue to occupy tables, walls, cabinets, and quiet corners. But the footsteps are slower. Theodore Roosevelt is 60 years old. That sounds surprisingly young when you remember the life already behind him. He has been a sickly child staring at birds through spectacles, a college student wearing boxing gloves, a young husband, a widower, a cattle rancher beneath Dakota skis, a father surrounded by children. A president pursued through White House corridors by family noise and unexpected animals. A reader carrying books into nearly every landscape he crossed. An explorer. A grandfather. And now in the winter of 1918 into 19, he has returned to the place that has always felt most like home. You walk with him through the rooms. The North Room, created as an addition to Sagamore Hill during his presidency, reflects the world he accumulated. Books. Animal trophies. Works of art. Gifts, objects connected with journeys and friendships. A visitor might see a collection. Theodore sees memory. One object carries him west. Another suggests Africa. Another recalls someone who once sat nearby talking long after dinner should have ended. The room functioned almost like an autobiography without sentences. You do not need to open a book to see the different Theodore Roosevelts gathered together. The naturalist is here. The hunter is here. The politician is here. The father is here, and somewhere beneath them all remains the boy who wanted to understand every strange creature he encountered. You move toward the bookshelves. Thousands of volumes became associated with Roosevelt's life and reading, though the exact arrangement of books changed through the years. That detail matters. Historic homes can sometimes appear frozen, as though everyone left a room precisely as you now see it. Real houses are never so obedient. Books migrate. Chairs move. Children borrow things. Guests leave objects behind. A volume once resting beside Theodore's chair might spend another month upstairs. The private Sagamore Hill was constantly rearranging itself. What survives gives you the shape of the life rather than a perfect photograph of every day. Perhaps that is enough? You place your hand near the edge of a desk. This is where letters accumulated. Theodore wrote at remarkable length throughout his life. Public arguments reached the page, certainly, but so did family affection. He wrote about children. Animals, books, weather, journeys, illness, plans. He sometimes added drawings. His written world became almost as crowded as the physical house. And now those papers preserve voices that the rooms themselves cannot. You continue upstairs. Bedrooms carry a different kind of history. Public figures become most ordinary where they sleep. There is no audience at 2 a.m, no cheering crowd, no official title that can force the body to rest comfortably. By his final months, Theodore's health has become increasingly troublesome. Inflammatory illness and physical damage from earlier years have left him in pain. He is treated in hospital during late 1918 and eventually returns home. The man who once treated nearly every physical limitation as an opponent now has fewer ways to overcome what his body is doing. Still, his mind remains interested in the world. Visitors continue to matter. Books continue to matter. Family remains near. Ida remains at the center. You think back to the childhood companion who once read with Theodore long before either could have imagined Sagamore Hill. Their marriage has now lasted more than 3 decades. She has watched him leave for campaigns, ranches, hunting grounds, political battles, foreign journeys, and dangerous expeditions. She has managed houses full of children and guests. She has protected privacy wherever she could. She has endured separations and losses. Now she shares the quietest part of the journey. On the evening of January 5th, 1919, Theodore goes to bed at Sagamore Hill. The night outside is cold. The familiar house settles around him. You can imagine the sounds, wind passing through winter branches, the occasional movement of wood, a distant household footstep, then stillness. During the night, Theodore Roosevelt dies in his sleep. He's found the following morning. There is no need for a grand scene. The quiet tells you enough. One of the most energetic lives in American memory ends inside a bedroom at home. Not on a mountain, not on horseback, not during an expedition. At Sagamore Hill, the place to which he had always returned. News travels quickly beyond Oyster Bay. Public tributes follow. Newspapers begin turning the man into history almost immediately. Stories are repeated. Achievements are measured. Political arguments return. The public Theodore Roosevelt grows larger, but you remain inside the house. That is where this journey has always belonged. You notice his spectacles. Without them, much of the distant world had once been blurred. You notice worn books whose importance came from being opened rather than displayed. You notice desks where family letters were written. You notice trophies from landscapes that helped shape his complicated ideas about nature. You remember the sounds of children who once ran through rooms that now seem impossibly still. Private lives leave unusual traces. The grandest object is not always the most revealing. A small drawing in a letter may tell you more about a father than an official portrait. A strong cup of coffee may reveal a morning habit more clearly than a formal schedule. A muddy path can explain a philosophy of living. A child's pony entering an elevator can tell you what kind of household existed behind presidential walls. And a shelf of heavily used books can reveal where an apparently restless man found stillness. There are uncertainties everywhere. Some favorite Roosevelt stories have been embellished. Some exact conversations cannot be recovered. Some family emotions remain impossible to measure. Some ordinary days disappeared without leaving a single written line. You should allow those silences to remain. Private history does not become more beautiful when every mystery is forced into an answer. Sometimes the unanswered room is the most honest room in the house. You walk downstairs again. Late afternoon light reaches through the windows. For a moment you can almost reconstruct the Sagamore Hill of earlier summers. The doors stand open. Children are shouting outside. A dog crosses the hallway. Someone has come for lunch. Edith is quietly adjusting a plan. Theodore is talking about a book while preparing to go somewhere else entirely. Then the vision softens. The house returns to winter. What remains is not merely the story of an unusually energetic president. You have discovered something smaller. A boy frightened by asthma who learned to love movement. A reader who rarely travelled without books. A husband repeatedly leaving and returning home. A father who wrote drawings into letters. A man who welcomed animals, mud children, visitors, and intellectual arguments into the same domestic world. Theodore Roosevelt's extraordinary private life was extraordinary partly because he refused to divide living into neat categories. Family flowed into adventure. Books flowed into conversation. Nature flowed into home. Work flowed into recreation. And beneath everything ran a constant curiosity. I wanted to see, to know, to experience, to tell someone about it afterward. Now you stand at the doorway of Sagamore Hill. Behind you the rooms grow quiet. Ahead Oyster Bay lies beneath the pale winter sky. You close the door gently. Word count 1 Maisem. And now there is nowhere else you need to go. The road beyond Sagamore Hill can remain empty tonight. The horses are resting. The books have been closed. No letter needs answering before morning. You can leave the Roosevelt family inside the warm rooms of memory and allow the winter evening to settle gently around the house. Imagine the lamps disappearing one by one. A hallway grows dim. Firelight becomes a low amber glow. Outside bare branches move slowly against the night sky. Farther down the hill, the dark water of Oyster Bay rises and falls almost without sound. The house has carried so much life. Children racing across floors, dogs appearing beneath tables, visitors talking beside crowded shelves, Edith moving quietly through familiar routines, Theodore turning pages faster than anyone expects. Now all of those sounds can soften together. You do not have to remember dates. You do not have to hold on to every name. The small images are enough. A boy examining a feather, a father drawing an animal in a letter, a wet coat hanging after a long ride, a book beside a lamp, a summer window left open toward the tree. History is often remembered through noise. Tonight you have found it in quieter places, in breakfast rooms, bedrooms, libraries, country paths, family jokes, handwritten pages. These small traces wait patiently long after the people themselves have gone. And as the house grows darker, you can let the century drift away with it. Theodore's footsteps fade, the voices fade, even the last lamp seems to soften. Only the winter wind remains moving gently through the trees above Oyster Bay. You can rest now. The old house will keep its memories until morning,